So she might stay here, and then I might try to go solo with the kids, which is
yeah.
We'll see. How about yourself?
Perfect. We have a birthday party on Sunday. That's it.
Okay. Great.
Yeah. Thank you, John.
Okay. Chat. There it is.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Capstone Research Symposium with our class of 2021. We do have a packed schedule, so I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we'll go ahead and get started. For the presenters, I will be timing you. So at 5 minutes, you'll get a 5-minute warning, and then 2 minutes, 1 minute, and then a time's up. I'll be flashing a Post-it note. So just have someone on your team be on the lookout for that. So it's a 15-minute presentation followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from faculty members, students, and other guests that are with us today. So to kick it off, our first group today will be Lorena and Marlene. And sorry, need to put, there we go. And they will be discussing undocumented college students in the Inland Empire, a look at academic engagement and institutional climate, and their faculty mentor is Professor Cecilia Ayon. So ladies, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
All right, I guess moment of truth.
Oh. Okay. Presenter view. All right, does it look good now? Okay.
Everyone can see it, right? Okay, well, hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Lorena Rosas.
And I'm Marlene Chavez.
Our capstone project for our MPP is Undocumented College Students in the IE, a look at academic engagement and institutional climate.
With the help of our advisor, Cecilia Ayon, we had access to the unique data set of undocumented students across California's public universities collected by the UC Promise. This allowed for the opportunity to further look into data pertaining to the IE.
This research was of interest and is important to me since not only am I part of the IE community, but CSUSB is my alma mater, and soon UCR will be as well. I'm also undocumented, and my pursuit for higher education has been long and brutal, but I have been able to see the changes and progress that have allowed the journey to become more accessible. I am also the DACA Program Associate for the UC Immigrant Legal Services Center, and this research will allow me to further understand current struggles the community I work with is encountering.
I'm also a child of immigrants, and I've been living in the IE for about 17 years now. I currently work with immigrant youth in the Inland Empire, where year-round we bring in programs, events, or activities specifically working to promote the health, education equity, and overall well-being of youth. So this study overlaps a lot with what I do at my job and can further inform us with what tools or support we can consider providing for youth to continue encouraging their success as a student and beyond. Our capstone has two main goals. First, we created a regional profile of undocumented students in the IE to inform practice and policy advocacy work that directly applies to collaborating with community stakeholders.
Next, we wanted to examine factors associated with academic engagement for undocumented students at UCR and CSUSB, specifically looking at legal vulnerabilities and campus climate variables. However, due to time limitations, we will focus our attention on the regression model.
To provide a bit of context, there are 247,000 unauthorized immigrants living in the IE. Specific to our population of interest, undocumented youth, those who are 16 to 24 years old make up 33,000 of undocumented folks in the IE, specifically 15,000 in San Bernardino and 18,000 in Riverside.
And according to Undocumented Student Service coordinators at UCR and CSUSB, there are approximately 636 undergraduate undocumented students at UCR and 724 at CSUSB. These numbers are based on the California DREAM Act applications, as they are the most reliable method to track undocumented undergraduates. As I had briefly mentioned, there has been progress to further support undocumented students pursuing higher education. With constant advocacy, these policies have created inclusive opportunities. We start off with AB 540 in 2001, which expanded in-state tuition for non-residents to students who attended at least 3 years of high school in California. Then 10 years later, the California DREAM Act was implemented. These policies awarded Cal grants, university grants, BOG waivers, and scholarships administered through the university to those who qualify for AB 540. Note that this is the California DREAM Act as opposed to the proposed federal DREAM Act that was first introduced in 2001. 20 years later, and I'm still waiting for it to make it past the Senate. If anyone has any questions about this, we can further discuss later, but that's a whole other debate. Moving on, then in 2014, the AB 540 requirements were expanded under AB 2000. This allowed for elementary and middle school attendance to fulfill the requirements for in-state tuition. And to further expand those requirements in 2017, SB 68 included years of attendance at community college and California adult schools for AB 540. These policies are important because without them, many undocumented students who have lived in California for most of their lives would have to pay non-resident tuition fees. This also opened up the opportunity for undocumented groups over 18 who might not have gone to high school, but still wanted to pursue college to be able to pay for in-state tuition. Now, specific to the UC system, in 2016, under the former UC president, Janet Napolitano, a commitment was implemented to further support undocumented population across all UCs. This included establishing a center and staff that would provide resources for undocumented students. The most recent inclusive bill signed by Governor Newsom in 2019 was AB 1645, which is still pretty new, but requires a designated Dreamer liaison for community colleges and CSUs who don't already have one. This one person is expected to be knowledgeable in financial aid and other support services to assist AB 540 students. At a federal level, some undocumented youth are eligible for DACA, which provides protection from deportation and a work permit. However, this has no impact on eligibility for in-state tuition or financial assistance. So please note that not all undocumented college students have DACA.
Even though there's active policies to support undocumented students in California, undocumented students face additional unique stressors as they pursue higher education. For example, undocumented students' pursuit to a degree is affected by feelings of shame and uncertainty, and they report higher levels of perceived discrimination on an institutional and individual level. Anti-immigrant attitudes in particular feed the likelihood that undocumented students will face social exclusion and shape students' decisions to hide their lack of legal standing. Students are aware and articulate about the stereotypes on discrimination against undocumented immigrants. Next, fear of deportation continues to be present for undocumented and DACA students in higher education. Despite the protection from deportation that DACA provides for its beneficiaries, it does not extend to protect the threat of deportation for family and members of their community. And lastly, undocumented students do not qualify for federal financial aid, federal loans, grants, and work-study programs. Undocumented students are barred from applying for certain jobs due to lack of citizenship status, and without any work authorization, they are limited from legally obtaining a job. Although DACA students do have a legal work permit, they usually work low-wage, multiple jobs, or take on long hours to support themselves and their families. At the same time, families may also experience a financial burden as they try to provide as much financial support as they can. These struggles may cause undocumented students to enroll part-time or to opt out of school for a while, causing them to finish, but over a long period of time.
And to combat some of these challenges, some campuses have undocumented student centers present, reinforcing the notion of undocumented students are safe on campus. These spaces create a visible support system from admission all the way to graduation. And while those in higher education may not be able to influence legislation, they can provide a less hostile environment for their undocumented students by attending undocumented allied trainings and learning how to advocate for their undocumented student population. This includes understanding the challenges undocumented students face along with policies. Typically, these trainings are offered once a year and can take up to 5 hours. However, a smaller departmental trainings could range from 1 to 2 hours. Now that we have provided some background on undocumented students in higher ed, we will move on to our methodology.
To begin, we conducted a secondary analysis from the UC Collaborative to promote immigrant and student equity, also known as the UC Promise. This study surveys 4 groups of students in 9 UC and 9 CSU campuses from March to June 2020. The survey contains a sample including undocumented students, but for the purpose of our capstone, we focus on undocumented students in the IE, those from UCR and CSUSB totaling to 227. Here are the sample characteristics for students across UCR, CSUSB, and the 2 IE campuses combined. As you can see, gender, race, age, immigration status were similar across both campuses and the entire sample. However, the only real difference within these groups is that more San Bernardino students were first or second years. Moreover, our descriptive report addressed the 4 different categories for UCR, CSUSB, and IE students combined, along with the rest of the campuses in the California Public University system, being mental health, academics, legal vulnerability, and campus climate.
Moving on to our regression outcome variables. In our regression, we're trying to figure out if legal vulnerabilities or campus climate will impact academic engagement. The survey included positive and negative academic engagement variables. Items for each skill were computed with higher scores on each skill representing affirmation of either positive or negative academic engagement. Positive academic engagement is composed of 4 questions, capturing whether a student sought academic help from an instructor or tutor, studied with groups, or contributed to a class discussion. For negative engagement, questions included student failed to turn in any coursework, went to class unprepared, or skipped class. The predictors we use in our regression represent legal vulnerabilities that have been documented in the literature. And we also wanted to examine the role of campus climate variables. We ran these models independently for positive and negative academic engagement. Questions under legal vulnerability, we used 2 subscales of the Perceived Immigration Policy Effect Scales, abbreviated as PIPES, where respondents were asked to indicate how frequently they felt about their experiences and feelings about the immigration policy context. Each response ranged from 1 to 5, representing never, rarely, sometimes, often, and always. The discrimination subscale includes items such as how often did you feel silenced by others or felt your opinion didn't matter. The threat to family subscale assesses how participants fear or worry about the impact immigrant policies have on them or their family. Food insecurity was used as a proxy for financial strain. Our campus climate variables include positive campus attitudes towards immigrants. So these are if respondents heard or witnessed, if faculty, staff, students, or community members expressed positive feelings about undocumented immigrant communities. We also included negative campus attitudes, which is again very similar to how positive campus attitudes are presented, but if respondents heard or witnessed negative feelings towards undocumented immigrant communities. Lastly, we have campus sense of belonging, which is also composed of a 4-question scale that measures the student's sense of belonging to the university. We also controlled for demographic variables, including age, year in school, hours worked, and system, acknowledging the difference in the institutions, one being a UC and the other a CSU, which have different resources available. Working hours was selected to take into account the limited time students have to their academics and campus involvement. Age and year in school provided a visual for which group of undocumented students were being accounted for.
We used a hierarchical regression model where we added our variables in blocks. That way, we're able to see the changes in the model as we added our variables. Block 1 included the control variables, Block 2 included the legal vulnerability variables, and Block 3 included the campus climate variables. We didn't see any significance until we added the 3rd block, which were the campus climate variables. So a higher score of positive attitudes towards immigrants and sense of belonging on campus was associated with a higher score on positive academic engagement. It was interesting to see that discrimination, threat of family separation, food insecurity, and negative attitudes towards immigrants were not significant or did not hinder students' positive academic engagement behaviors. And the highlighted F just demonstrates that the 3rd model is significant.
The results for the negative academic engagement indicated working 21 hours or more significantly impacts the student's academic engagement across all 3 models. That is, students who reported working 21 hours or more experienced higher levels of negative academic engagement compared to those who did not work. Students who work a lot may experience more challenges completing class assignments and preparing for class. The institution variable indicates UCR students reported higher levels of negative academic engagement compared to CSUSB students. However, this variable dropped when the campus climate variables were included in the model. Regarding legal vulnerability, discrimination was significant. That is, students who reported more experiences with discrimination reported higher level of negative academic engagement. However, this also became non-significant once we added the campus climate variables. Food insecurity was also found to be significant. Students who reported food insecurity also reported higher levels of negative academic engagement. This remains significant in the final model. Overall, these results show undocumented students working 21 hours or more, and food insecurity is associated with negative academic engagement.
Consequently, there were some limitations to the study. 75% of the sample of undocumented students in the IE identified as female and 93 identified as Latinx. In addition, there may be a potential sampling bias. Recruitment announcements were distributed widely, including emails and social media posts from each campus Undocumented Resource Center office, large general education courses, or department and university newsletters. It is possible that these invites only reach those students who are actually connected to their campus resource centers, meaning the study only captured the answers of a few, select few on campus. Next, the design for the study was cross-sectional, which is generally used to provide a snapshot of information for your sample at a fixed point in time. Our results cannot speak to causality, but it does describe a relationship between the predictor variables and the types of academic engagement. This study also took place during the beginning months of the pandemic, and it's possible that it could have influenced responses as we entered a period of uncertainty. We found implications in our study that can be applied at two levels. Beginning at the community level, the dataset has created the opportunity to create a comprehensive profile of undocumented students attending California public universities in the IE. There's currently limited information about the experiences of these students on campus and their academic engagement. Our work can be expanded on and researched further because questions may arise from the dataset, and these may be ideas we can further explore. It can also further increase awareness on strengths and challenges for campus, community organizations, stakeholders, and the community to identify where each of them can do their part and intervene. We can also draw from the students' experiences to identify what it is we might already be doing well in creating inclusive environments for undocumented students at UCR and CSUSB. Our research can also help provide information for organizations to write grants, create initiatives, opportunities for students during and post-college, and work to enhance undocumented student networks for students to facilitate their academic experience. Lastly, both of these institutions can work together to address challenges and create a college experience that is responsive to the multifaceted needs of undocumented college students.
At an institutional level, there is a need for further support, such as more stipend opportunities to include those students who do not have a work permit. Additionally, improve access to food pantry services. This includes having flexible hours for on-campus resources. As seen in our regression, UCR students working 21 hours or more already have limited time available on campus, and with the food pantry closed for the times these resources are needed, it further impacts the students' academic engagement. One way CSUSB is able to expand food pantry services on campus is by distributing daily packs at resource centers for students to have the ability to access food from the spaces they visit or have more accessibility. To continue the positive academic engagement, there needs to be a campus climate intervention by expanding the undocumented allied trainings and are making them a requirement to attend once a year. Lastly, when transitioning out of academic institutions, students should be able to rely on the community support, especially when it comes to financial insecurities. These students are going from having a safe space to not fully exposed to the real world. Keeping the momentum going with their active engagement now onto the community will result in an uplifting environment.
And this concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, and be gentle with your questions.
Thank you so much. Great job. Now I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. If you have a question, if you could please use the raise hand feature, and then I will go ahead and unmute you so that you can ask your question of Marlene and Lorena. Professor Link, go ahead and ask your question.
Joe, thanks so much for this work. I wanted to say a couple of things about it. one thing I wanted to say is that it was important that, you know, you had the foundation of Cecilia's work where you used some of her scales. I just wanted to remark on what a contribution that's been. And this project was able to benefit from that foundation that had been set. You were able to use her measures. The and I thought you did a great job of presenting your regression results and so on. One thought I had that I'd love to hear you say a little bit about is the impact of the broader political institutional context and what's been going on in our country, and if there was any way to see about that, any specific questions about you know, the way in which our president, maybe at the time the survey was being done, was talking and things like that. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that and how that sets a broader context where some of the rest of these things are embedded.
Do you want to go, Marlene, or want me to go?
You could take a stab at it first. I'll go after.
So then there's a question of like, how is the political environment right now on campus now that the change of presidency? Sorry, I wasn't sure if I understood it correctly.
Oh, wasn't quite, I might have missed when exactly your survey was done, but yeah, but what I was thinking is some of these things it's sort of like the discrimination is layered. It happens at this great big, you know, political level of our country and whether or not we're threatening people with taking DACA away. And then that kind of cascades down to influence what goes on for these kids. Excuse me, kids. That's how old I am. Students, you know, what their experience is like. And I wondered about your thinking about that bigger, broader context and how it might have impacted some of the things that you saw in your study.
That's actually really true and a great point, because this survey was conducted in from March 2020 through June 2020. And in June 18 of 2020 was when the Supreme Court announced basically indicating that DACA was not going to be ended. And I know that was something that many were waiting for the announcement to be made of the uncertainty of such policy. So maybe some of these surveys or responses were collected during the time where it was still not announced. I don't know until exactly what was the end date in June, but I know there was that uncertainty still in the environment. I'm not sure if Marlene wants to add.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question? Sorry.
Yes, very good.
Okay.
Good job.
Thank you, Professor Link. Are there any other questions?
Jolene, I had a question and I
Oh,
can't find
Paul-
my raise
Paul-
the hand.
Paul beat you to the punch. So
Oh,
I'm going to
he
go
always does.
Paul, Professor Deneri, and then you, Kurt.
Sure, thank you.
Don't try to jump the queue, Kurt.
I've been put in my place.
Marlene, Lorena, I enjoyed the presentation. My question's a pretty simple one that I always ask, which is, what of your findings surprised you the most? Either in terms of what you yourselves expected or in terms of what you saw in the literature that you read before you started the project. Thanks.
I can answer that. So I wanted to just highlight that this study really just demonstrated how resilient undocumented students are, because they have a lot of different challenges besides just navigating higher ed for the first time. So they still have to deal with deportation, financial insecurities at high levels, and other students because of work authorization. And so I think it was just it just kind of highlighted how resilient they are. They essentially have to live against the backdrop of these issues and just figure out how they're going to do it and just constantly problem solve. And also I think it's just important to mention that students may feel that they're lucky or privileged to attend these academic institutions, which further serves as motivation for them to go on with their degrees as well. they do feel that social responsibility to continue with school because they always refer back to like the sacrifices that their parents have made to be in this country. And yeah, I just really appreciate that from this study. And it was really, really awesome to see that.
Yeah, and it was interesting just to see as well, just to add on how like it was the positive campus climate that had the association with the positive academic engagement and not necessarily like the legal vulnerabilities, like even like they have there's all these issues present. It's the having that safe environment that really impacts the amount of like positive academic engagement that is being able to experience.
Thank you. Professor Schwabe.
Yeah, good job. And I think you hit your mark when you said you wanted to draw awareness to this in a more systematic fashion. So excellent job here. For some reason, I decided to anchor on that work variable, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I couldn't tell whether that was just UCR or campus employment, or was it all employment? And it seemed like it went from like 1 to 20 and greater than 20, if that was right. And in that sense, I can see where maybe working more than 20 hours had a negative effect, but I'm wondering if there was maybe, if you didn't have a job, you wouldn't be able to go to college. Was that a discussion at all even? I mean.
Well, the reference category is to like, it goes from work 1 to 20 hours, and then the reference category being not working, and then 21 hours or more to not working.
Okay, so you had a default of not working at all.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. And was that just campus work, or was it work overall?
Work overall.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any final questions from the audience for Marlene and Lorena?
I'll just make a comment if we have time. Yeah. So I just want to say a great job to both of you. I know this is, we've been working on this data as the UC Promise project. We've been working on this data analysis for a year, and the data is really complex. It's a really large data set, and I think you did such a great job of like navigating through the data, identifying variables that you were passionate and committed to, and I just wanted to congratulate you on such a great job that you did.
Thank you. Couldn't do it without you, Dr. Yon.
Well, yeah, thank you for the support, definitely.
All right, thank you very much. I am sorry, ladies, I'm going to remove your panelist abilities now. So thank you very much. And I will be letting the next group in as panelists. So just give me a couple seconds to get all that switched over.
Can you guys hear me? Okay.
All right. So now I'd like to introduce Eddie, Esteban, Natalie, and Reina, and they will be discussing minority-owned business resilience in times of a pandemic, the case of COVID-19 in the IE region. Their faculty mentors are Professor Qingfang Wang and then Professor Wei Kang. So everyone take it away.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Like Jolene just mentioned, our project is on small business resilience in times of a pandemic, the case of COVID-19 in the IE region. The members of our group are Esteban, Eddie, Reina, and myself, Natalie, and our advisors are Dr. Wong and Dr. Kong. So we all know someone that has had their health impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, but the economic impacts affected us all economically, and small businesses were at the height of the headlines. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, small businesses in the US were employing about 50% of the workforce. But with the pandemic, the business of small business owners fell about 22%. Minority and female-owned businesses were disproportionately affected more than white and male-owned businesses, according to a national study done at the height of COVID-19 pandemic. Now we will focus on the Inland Empire area, which we will now refer to as the IE. The IE small businesses experienced an 89% large negative impact in 2020, and it has continued to have a large negative effect at a slightly lower percentage. However, the sectors that were most disproportionately affected were consumer services, retail, food service, healthcare, and social services.
The questions we are seeking to answer are: how have Latina businesses in the IE region been coping with the impacts of COVID-19? And what are the key factors for their resilience? In particular, what is the role of government business aid programs, and how are they allocated to the regions of the IE?
So the first part of our data methodology includes a qualitative, in-depth 114 interviews of small business owners and community stakeholders to capture in depth how the COVID-19 outbreak impacted small businesses in the IE, like minority-owned, women-owned, and male-owned businesses. The second part of our data we gathered was a list of resources at the federal to local level to understand the resources available for different areas in the IE region. The third component is a reproducible quantitative data with 3 layers to understand the resources and vulnerability in the IE businesses by concentrating the data and analysis at the zip code level. Lastly, we triangulated the qualitative and quantitative data to gain a greater perspective.
With the help of the National Latina Businesswomen Association, a total of 114 in-depth interviews were conducted to gain an understanding of the business's experience in coping with the COVID-19 crisis. The interviews consisted of 17 in-depth interviews with community stakeholders, including representatives from federal and local government. Those interviews focused on their roles and interactions with small businesses. The rest of the interviews are composed of 64 Latina-owned businesses, 20 male-owned businesses, and 13 female business owners from other racial and ethnic groups. Through our research, we found that every participant expressed concerns about severe impacts of their region and the local community due to COVID. We found impacts at both personal and business levels. At the personal level, impacts that we found included isolation, stress, emotional toll, and issues related to mental health. At the business level, the majority of businesses have expressed moderate to large negative impacts. Furthermore, impacts on Latina-owned businesses and Latina businesses owners and their businesses also extended to the broader Latino community. We also identified key factors in their coping skills. We found that these businesses need timely and accurate information about the current situation on medical guidelines, government programs, and resources at different government levels. Knowledge is essential for these businesses to take advantage of assistance, resources, and to pivot to new opportunities and operational strategies. Businesses also need technology. With social distancing and stay-at-home orders, technology efficiency became crucial for the business survival. And lastly, businesses also need social networks to bring in repeated clients, reliable employees, and to provide access to untapped markets, financial opportunities, and information on resources.
The impact of business participants from the interviews showed that during the COVID-19 pandemic, 55% of the Latina-owned businesses had negative impacts, which you could see in blue. And in green, you could see the 11% positive impacts they had. Meanwhile, the non-Latina-owned women businesses had 69% negative impacts, which is again shown in blue, but none of them had positive impacts. The male business owners had 55% negative impacts, and again shown in blue, and in green, you could see the 5% positive impacts they had. This might sound strange, but a caveat is that we did interview more Latina-owned businesses, and the majority of the Latina-owned businesses had business membership affiliations that helped them stay informed, yet there was still a 55% negative impact, which shows the systematic difficulties that minority or Latina-owned businesses face.
Business aid programs have significantly helped businesses who receive them in both to address short-term needs as well as paving a road for long-term development. The major federal programs are the Payment Protection Plan, also known as the PPP, and the COVID-19 Economic Injury Disaster Loan, commonly known as the EIDL loan. And then there were also grants and assistance from local governments. This table summarizes the percentage of applicants and recipients of the government programs from our interviews. 30% of Latinas did not apply for federal aid, while 9 were denied. 44 received federal aid, and 20% received local aid. 8% of non-Latina women did not apply for federal aid, while 23% were denied. However, 96% did receive federal aid, and 20% did receive local aid. 35% of men did apply for federal aid, and of those who applied, 0 were denied. 40% received federal aid, and 15% received local aid. In sum, about 43% of our project participants did receive federal financial support from different government business aid programs.
So when talking about policies for COVID relief, let me begin by providing some background on the CARES Act. The CARES Act was signed into law March of 2020 in response to the increasing threat of COVID-19 on the US economy. As we discussed earlier, the US was facing an unprecedented small business crisis, and it was through the CARES Act that the Payment Protection Program was introduced. For our study, we focused on Inland Empire cities. So while looking for policy documentation, we looked into the 52 cities that make up Riverside and San Bernardino counties. And we split the counties by east and west so that we were able to look at metropolitan areas and also more rural areas like Adelanto and Blat. When looking at PPP loan advertisements across the Inland Empire, we found that some cities did not advertise for these COVID relief programs or referred to county, state, and federal aid. For other cities, they were able to provide aid to businesses that met loan criteria. Several cities in the IE had a common method of distributing grants through the community block development grants. These amounts vary depending on the type of business and also the employee size. Certain cities provided aid for personal protective equipment and other business adjustments to meet COVID restrictions. So some of these adjustments included issuing outdoor business permits for expanded outdoor operations. And then we also saw that third parties and corporations created their own grants, such as the Facebook Small Business Grants Program, which was posted on the COVID resources page for some of the cities.
Yes, so to supplement what Reina mentioned and Eddie mentioned, the Paycheck Protection Program is a loan designed to keep workers on payroll and to keep businesses afloat. So the map on the screen that you guys see on your screen there is the total number, the projected total number of PPP loans dispersed within Riverside and San Bernardino County. We were able to do that by merging our PPP data by including that with the county business pattern shapefile by zip code. So each polygon then on the map is going to have its own color scheme. So therefore, just going off of the legend on the top right of the screen, you can notice that within the blue circle, zip codes like 92277, 92309, 92364, just to name a few, places like Joshua Tree, parts of San Bernardino, Lucerne Valley, and typically the areas of the high desert receive total smaller amounts of total PPP loans. And then in contrast, if we look at the red circle, you can notice that zip codes such as 91709, 92562, 9250, which are places like Chino Hills, Temecula, Rancho Cucamonga, Ontario, are areas that received higher amounts of total PPP loans. But again, this is just the aggregate number of PPP loans. And if we were to look at, if we were to look at the next slide, this one shows you the rate. This figure shows the PPP rate. And so this map considers our population at risk, and it's a little bit different than the other map that we showed you in the last slide. The PPP rate was calculated by dividing total number of PPP loans in a zip code against the number of active small businesses in the zip code. So in doing so, it generated a map that changed our polygon colors. And so the PPP rate demonstrates that the rate metric was dispersed without a predictable pattern, and it was randomly distributed within the polygons. So the color schemes are the same as it was in the last slide. When we switch back and forth between both maps, there are some visible differences. So for instance, some polygons had strong total number of loans, but less in terms of a PPP rate. And then the same goes for polygons who had smaller amounts of total PPP loans, but their PPP rate was much higher. Therefore, just looking at the blue circle again, you can see that 92277, the same area as before, Joshua Tree, parts of San Bernardino, areas of high desert, their color scheme changed from the light blue color that we saw before to an orange, to a red, to a dark blue colors. And then in addition, if we were to look at the red circle, you can see areas like Chino Hills that were predominantly red and orange and light orange. Now there's some sort of variation with light blue, dark blue. And so having this comparable metric, such as the PPP rate, also allowed us to superimpose it on the next layer, which is the social vulnerability index.
So here in this figure, we're looking at the social vulnerability index, or the SVI. Social vulnerability refers to the potential negative effects on communities caused by external stresses on human health. So for this figure, our data values are the zip codes in the Inland Empire and where they rated on that index. There were no higher or lower outliers in the SVI for these IE zip codes. However, areas presented in darker orange are considered to be the most vulnerable. In the Riverside and San Bernardino metropolitan areas, you could actually see more variation in those vulnerable neighborhoods. So you see darker orange, lighter blue, and then darker blue as well. And notice dark orange areas in the eastern parts of both counties. These areas already had lower population sizes and were also more remote.
So this figure here is my favorite. It complements the other maps that we have shown thus far. So this one is called, this figure is called the correlation coefficient graph, which shows the relationship between the PPP rate, PPP, social vulnerability index, VSB, and SB, which is the variables on the right-hand side. So higher values represent higher correlation, while the other values mean little to no correlation. So this can also be noticed by the color markers, where darker shades of red represent higher correlation. And just for the sake of time, you can also just see the pink rectangle that is highlighted. So the most notable correlation is between PPP and small businesses, where you can see a value of 0.95. Following that is PPP and vulnerable small businesses at 0.80, while SVI and PPP had a correlation of -0.1, and also 0.17 between PPP rate and also SVI. So therefore, we reveal based on the results that PPP loans were given accordingly to small businesses instead of a social vulnerability index, the social vulnerability index.
So here we see the relationship between the social vulnerability index, vulnerable small businesses, and the PPP distribution. The upper left map with the darker blue zip codes indicate areas which were higher on the SVI, but did not receive as many PPP loans. As we move further down the y-axis, those zip codes were lower on the social vulnerability index. On the bottom right map, these zip codes were the lowest on the vulnerability index, but were high on the vulnerable small business quantiles. And notice the darker red zip codes, which are indicating the higher PPP distribution. When looking at the distribution of the PPP, the program was actually doing well based on statistical data, just like what we saw with the correlation coefficients. However, the loans did not always go to these socially vulnerable zones. Areas that were higher on the SVI may not have had a high concentration of small businesses to begin with. And therefore, zip codes in underserved communities do not always receive PPP loans, if at all. On the other hand, areas lower on the SVI already had a higher concentration of the small businesses.
Sorry, Natalie's internet went down.
I think she's frozen.
No, her internet went down.
Okay.
Go ahead, Eddie.
Okay, perfect. So looking at all of our data, we see the need of the qualitative data to understand the quantitative patterns. Quantitative data, such as the vulnerable small businesses and the PPP loan distribution, did not include a large number of self-employed, sole proprietorships, and micro businesses. Some of those businesses may not have qualified for the federal aid. This shows the importance of the qualitative data, such as the interviews conducted for our study by our team. Some of those interviews did not appear on those layers of the vulnerable small businesses or PPP distribution because they did not qualify, or their businesses had no need for aid, or maybe they didn't want to apply for fear of going into debt, and also did not have much information about the programs available to them to begin with.
So what does this mean? So some of the major takeaways for small business resilience should be looked at both the short-term needs, but also the long-term needs to assist with small business operational longevity. So therefore, short-term strategies to cope with COVID-19 needs to be considered through a long-term small business context. So for traditionally underserved communities, there has to be permanent efforts to foster an inclusive, but also a comprehensive entrepreneur ecosystem where it's crucial for not only their business growth, but also the regional growth where they're located. So if you were to look at the blue box in the short-term needs, you can see that information and technology, good technology, leads to a long-term education and training in business practices. The red box, the social network and mentorship building, needs to be considered in the context of developing community social capital. So in doing so, Latina business resilience, but also the resilience of the community that they're working in are intertwined. So entities like stakeholders, nonprofits, government agencies would be more likely to extend their established networks to both, say, traditional and also non-traditional community-based networks.
We came up with several recommendations, but here we like to highlight a few. For small businesses, we like to recommend financial preparation. COVID-19 caught several businesses off guard, so having a financial preparation plan can be essential to keep a business afloat. For nonprofits, we recommend keep people informed. This means making access to information more direct and easier to find. For governments, this is reopening strategies. Major corporations were able to quickly adapt and continue their business operations. So governments must take into account the needs of small businesses when planning for reopening strategies of the economy.
So take it all together, one recommendation for future PPP loan type services, relief aid services. One of our recommendations was that small businesses get first dibs in getting a loan. And this recommendation really comes from the in-depth interviews that Reina and Natalie did last summer with community stakeholders, small businesses, and Latina business owners, including the literature review that we had, including the breakdowns of how we saw that the PPP eligibility loans were processed, especially in the first two stages, where it was a first come, first serve basis. So this recommendation is really a culmination of a lot of factors. So if you go to the next screen, Reina, in addition, yeah, keep going, keep going. And so in addition, we also end on a positive note, where we also have upcoming events where we are conducting a panel discussion based on our research question this summer. It's scheduled this summer, and we are going to engage small businesses, government agencies, and also nonprofits. And with that, we want to say thank you.
Thank you very much. I haven't seen Natalie jump back on yet. Reina?
She's still having trouble loading.
She's still having trouble.
or
Okay.
Logging back on. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure. I'm like looking for her in the attendee list. So when she jumps back on, I'll put her on as a panelist. I'd like to now open it up to questions from the audience. Please use the raise your hand feature and I will go ahead and unmute you. Professor Link, go ahead.
Wow, thanks for that great presentation. I mean, what I really liked about it is the triangulation between the quantitative and the qualitative. It's really hard to make those things go together, and you did a great job of that in indicating how, you know, one can add to the other. And the other thing I just, has to be underlie that is the great teamwork you must have achieved. I don't know if you all got along great, but the product was great, and it reflected great teamwork that must have been behind it. I have one very small thought about the project you did, and that is, I'm into this changing the lens in looking at inequality and how things roll out from what's the situation of those who are being disadvantaged to what the advantaged are doing to make sure they stay in a better spot. Because if they keep doing what they can do to stay in a better situation to get the loans first, they're going to run resistance against your proposal that the small business folks get first dibs. So I just wondered if you had any comments on that, if you interviewed any people who are kind of like in the more powerful circumstance to figure out how they respond when this happens, what they do to make sure they get the loans first and stuff like that. Just your thoughts about that.
Excuse me, definitely, I can answer that. In terms of the interviews, so that was one of the questions we asked, right, about their financial or access to financial support. And those who were well off, because a lot of our interviewers were well off, they already had established relationships prior to COVID-19 with banks, right? So they all had like their own personal lender, mostly who already had a relationship with the SBA. So those types of business aids programs came easy to them because those relationships were established. And so with a lot of these smaller, specifically Latino-owned businesses, the female-owned business interviews that we did, they struggled a little bit because they didn't have connections with the banks, relationships, even sometimes with accountants, because a lot of our interviewers or interviewees did turn either to their lender, their personal bank, or their accountant. So with the vulnerable population, that just made it even harder for them during COVID, because the banks, the lenders are inundated with requests, with applications. So definitely the people who already had established relationships fared better during COVID as well. I hope that answers your question.
It's great information. You just saw some of the things going on as you interviewed people. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Speak now or forever hold your peace. No? Okay. Thank you very much. Great presentation, everyone. So I'm going to switch everyone off the panelist mode. John, I know you're listening. If you could put the next group up, and I will I'll take care of our current group right now. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good job.
Yeah.
I'm back on now, Jolene and Kurt. Was it? Next is, are we on the fourth one now? This is the fourth presentation or third?
Third. So now to discuss the COVID-19 impact on post-secondary education, I'd like to introduce Alfredo, and he is, his faculty mentor was Professor Ching-Fong Wang. So you had double duty, Professor Wang. Thank you very much. So Alfredo, go ahead and take it away.
All right, I'm going to just kind of say what everyone usually says. Can you hear me? Okay, awesome. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Bear with me. You would think I would have this down by now, right? All right, is that visible? Perfect. All right, so good afternoon, Dean Delolakar, Associate Dean Kurt Schwabe, faculty, staff, family, friends, and guests. My name is Alfredo Barcenas, and I am pleased to present my capstone project to the UCR School of Public Policy titled Post-Secondary Education, the Impact of COVID-19 within the Inland Empire. At this time, I would like to also briefly thank a few people that made this opportunity happen. First, to my capstone advisor, thank you so much, Dr. Kyung-Fong Wang, for guiding me throughout this process and helping me identify a project that I was passionate about. I work in higher education, so this is something that falls in line with what I'm doing. And I also like to take this time to thank my family and friends who are here virtually. My mom, thank you so much for all your support, my partner, Jessica, as well. I'd like to begin with the issues that inspired me to conduct the research on this topic. As you all are aware, COVID-19 became a major disruption to colleges all across the nation, with institutions canceling in-person classes all across and moving them to online instruction only. The pandemic significantly altered every aspect of college life, including admissions and enrollment, and the transition to remote learning was extremely disruptive, especially for students from lower income households and with larger families. And the shift to online learning prompted many students within the nation to put their pursuit of higher education on hold. Furthermore, the impact COVID-19 had directly on higher education was adverse. According to a report conducted by the EdTrust West, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educational justice, found in a study that 70% of college students said they had to pay the bill for what they needed to attend classes. 82% of California college students not returning to school cited online learning as their reason for their decision. 13% of college students of color in California lacked internet access. And overall, the college system saw a 13% drop of enrollment for the first year students in fall of 2020. The objective for my research was aimed at using a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods to examine the impact that COVID-19 had on post-secondary education plans, specifically within the Inland Empire, as well as other places such as the United States, our state of California, and two major metropolitan areas, Los Angeles and San Francisco. Furthermore, my research sought out to identify the challenges that college students had that was not necessarily based on technology, but as well as the environment that they were a part of. My research questions included: what are the challenges that are facing students? How do the challenges differ by race, sex, and income? And how are college students coping with these challenges? It's a little bit of the background and kind of the evidence that was found during this project. Due to COVID-19 being such a new issue, the literature at the time and the evidence on this topic was very minimal, but a lot of data was collected from surveys and other think tanks and nonprofits that kind of included statistical reports. To begin, I think it's worth mentioning the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact it's had on our society. According to the CDC, over 32 million people have been infected with COVID-19. Sadly, over 580,000 deaths have been reported. But with some good news, there's been over 163 million vaccines administered. As for the disruption in higher education, according to a poll by the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center conducted last year, there was a 2.5% fall reduction in enrollment. Undergraduate enrollment, as I mentioned, was a primary factor of decline. And even more so, a report from the Power of the International Education saw a 43% drop of international student enrollment in fall 2020. It's also worth mentioning the hardships and challenges that folks faced. The impacts of the pandemic and the economic fallout have been widespread, but are noticeable among Black, Latino, and immigrant households. These impacts reflect long-standing inequities and stemming from structural racism in education, employment, housing, and healthcare. And according to our data from the U.S. Census Pulse Survey, 27% of U.S. adults reported some sort of hardship, financial hardship. They couldn't pay the bills, they couldn't pay rent, they couldn't pay food, et cetera. And of course, the same survey found the unemployment rate had jumped 6.1% and has remained constant since April of 2021. As for the research design of my project, in this study, as I mentioned, I used a combination of quantitative and qualitative data to analyze the impact COVID-19 had on post-secondary education at the national and county levels within the state of California. Our quantitative set of data used for this project came from the U.S. Census Household Pulse Survey that performed weekly surveys beginning of April 2020. The experimental household pulse survey was designed by the U.S. Census to quickly and efficiently deploy data collected on how people's lives have been impacted by the pandemic. Now, for the purposes of this project, 2 timeframes were selected to be compared with one another. Week 13, which was from August 19th to the 31st, and week 24, February 3rd through the 15th of 2021. Both surveys were selected as a way to compare the impact COVID-19 had at the onset of the pandemic and at the time which universities began their virtual instruction, and week 24 as cases of COVID-19 began to decline and vaccines were readily available. The data pulled for our first data set for each week had asked respondents general information, such as race, sex, household income, education level. And then the data pulled for our second data set also asked respondents the reasons that impacted their post-secondary education plans. This project also included a regression analysis using the log odds of canceling or reducing post-secondary coursework as our dependent variable against socioeconomic characteristics and at the individual and household levels as our independent variables. The study was conducted using this year's data from the Pulse survey from January 2021 through March of 2021. And for our qualitative research, we interviewed 11 students from 2 of the most populated universities within the Inland Empire, Cal State San Bernardino and the University of California, Riverside. Now, the goal for this analysis was to compare this data with our quantitative data and use this qualitative data to kind of show the realistic impact that the pandemic had on students. And here are key findings. The first set of data we analyzed focused on sex reported by the Pulse survey. From these graphs, we can see that females reported having canceled or reduced their post-secondary coursework at a higher percentage than males in week 13, but that flipped in week 24. Specifically within the Inland Empire, we saw that females remained at the rate in both weeks, a little over 55%. Our next data set focused on race. With over 54 million responses, the graphs here represent the percentage of respondents that canceled or reduced their coursework. And just from this data set alone, you can see that nationally, respondents of color were more likely to have responded that they canceled or reduced their coursework. More specifically, with what we see in the Inland Empire, was a switch of folks who reported being white, canceled or reduced their coursework at a higher percentage for the first week in 13 than 24. And respondents of color reported canceling or reducing their coursework at a much larger percentage in week 24. And our next data set looked into household income. For the purposes of this project, we put it into 4 different categories, as you see on your screen. Our data showed similar responses for weeks 13 and 24 in terms of percentage averages. What we can see here is respondents with lower income were more likely to respond having canceled or reduced their post-secondary coursework in comparison to the top 2 tier brackets of the income household in these charts. Our project included a logistic regression analysis that was for most part in sync with our responses from the survey. Our dependent variable, as I mentioned, was defined as a cancellation or reduction in post-secondary coursework. And what we see is several variables correlated with our dependent one. For the United States, California, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, our variables here, such as being Asian, age, family size, kid size, household income, and job loss, were all correlated when it came to our dependent variable. However, what we see in the Inland Empire, that does not matter, as what matters in the Inland Empire was family size, the number of children in a household, and income. For household income, the odds of canceling or reducing post-secondary coursework was less likely to happen with a higher level of income. So as you make more, you're less likely to cancel or reduce your coursework. For houses who had children under the age of 18, the odds of canceling or reducing post-secondary coursework became more likely with more children present in that household. And for family size, the odds of canceling or reducing post-secondary coursework was less likely to happen with one or more persons in the household over the age of 18. This data, while compelling, is only the surface of what actually happened with students, and our qualitative analysis only enhances and characterizes the numbers in detail. For example, one student said in our interview, "I apologize if I get a little teary-eyed. My mom was the main source of income, and then the year before that, my dad had been deported, so we were struggling financially. But thankfully, all three of my siblings and I work, so we're all pitching in to provide for rent, but we did end up losing our house and ended up moving into a little trailer. We were, in a sense, financially responsible for providing the income my mom couldn't provide at the time." This question was asked to a student while they were taking online courses and, being enrolled in a university. Another student had mentioned, "It was hard meeting deadlines, and it was hard being able to voice that to my professors and letting them know that I'm basically homeless. My parents are struggling. We had even contracted the virus as well. I only have one parent. We're still financially supporting my dad in Mexico as well. So that was really hard and trying to keep up. I was also thinking of dropping out in the beginning, but I kept pushing on, knowing that I love school and that's what I wanted to do. So I kept continuing." Kind of to the technological components and that the issues that students face. One student said, "There's so many technology issues that were just like, can you hear me over Zoom? And computers crashing. And if you're out of Wi-Fi, you can't work that day. And there's just all these technology things that definitely set you back. Whereas if I was at school, I could go rent a different laptop if my laptop's not working, or I can use a different laptop in my work office." And then one other student had mentioned, "I live in a low income area and I have parents that are immigrants. They don't understand the difficulty of online schooling, especially since I'm the only daughter. I'm expected to do all the traditional household things. I have to cook, I have to clean, I have to make sure that my brother's fed, make sure that everyone gets their coffee. I have to wake up at 5 a.m. So not only on top of being a student leader and a student, I'm also, in a sense, a caregiver." So from that same qualitative analysis, what we found, 100% of participants reported having issues with internet service, which caused disruption in their class. 100% of them reported some sort of flexibility, though, so a positive outcome that came from this. And 50% of them reported having, coronavirus themselves or a member of their household and dealing with that and having that as an issue in regards to their coursework. But what I want to note too is the student resiliency that came out of this. It's really the impact that came from students being able to handle this in a very, as best as they could. So one student said, "I'm not worried about running back and forth. Everything is just online. So I can be in my room. I'm comfortable. If I had to take my daughter to a dentist appointment, I would have missed the class versus there were so many professors that would record the meeting so that I can go to refer back to it." And then another student had mentioned, "I feel like the pandemic has taught me to balance because I know back when I was in Riverside, I would actually complete my work before heading home. So I wouldn't have anything to worry about. But right now, being at home, I have to worry about school and helping my parents. So I actually have to be more on top of things." So it's just kind of building that responsibility of students and kind of time managing their responsibilities while they were distance learning. So some of the main takeaways from this project that I saw, the disadvantages in the Inland Empire region. Based on our analysis of the household pulse survey, we saw that the Inland Empire suffered more from this pandemic in regards to income and race. Our regression results, income and household matters. Odds of students canceling or reducing post-secondary coursework was correlated with income and household. And ultimately, student resiliency, dealing with the century crisis. Although there was a lot of challenges, students were still managing to be able to carry on in their studies. From this project, areas that can be looked at when considering certain policy changes can focus on a few things. First, one way of supporting students, especially from low-income socioeconomic backgrounds, can be to increase financial aid or consider the elimination of student debt. If students were supported with their finances, they're able to support a lot of the things that they had to pay out of pocket. However, the challenge here is government bureaucracy, and the issue is polarized. Another example or another area to consider in assisting students is increase in institutional support at universities. While campuses close their physical doors to students during the pandemic, universities should consider enhancing the services to meet the needs even virtually and reconsider abrupt closures in emergencies. Contingency plans should be put into place to assist the more vulnerable of students. And finally, it's important to ensure communities are also supporting their own, and in this case, not put the pressure necessarily on the universities. Our data comes from an area that represents marginalized and low socioeconomic communities, so ensuring government budgets align with the needs and wants of its citizens should be critical in case we face another disaster. And in closing, it's worth mentioning the limitations for this project in future areas of research. The pulse survey responses, the consistency of whether participants participated from the beginning of April all the way until now. The small qualitative sample, this project is not perfect, but we can look at not just interviewing students, but as well as faculty and administration and local community members. And finally, there was limited research on the subject at the time that this project was being done. So now that more research is coming out to explore that and to be able to input that into further research as we move forward. And with that being said, I hope, we were able to take something out of this. And I know I was very passionate about this project. So I want to thank my faculty advisor, the School of Public Policy, and every guest and family member who showed up today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. All right, let me bring up Anil, you have a question, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay. Amazing presentation, Alfredo, and it's really impressive what you have been able to do. It is amazing that you did all that quantitative work, not just for one group of students from across the US, but you disaggregated it by state, for the Inland Empire. Truly amazing. I commend you for being able to do all this and accomplish all this within 2 short quarters.
Thank you.
Couple of questions. One was on the regression. So I'll just quickly sort of state my questions. One, do you have some reasons why when you presented the tables, the descriptive data in the beginning, the Inland Empire seemed to be very different from the state of California and the nation in terms of white students being disproportionately affected in terms of delaying or postponing their educational plans early on in the pandemic, and then that sort of switched around later on, right? And I was wondering if you had any speculation for why that might be the case. Let me just quickly sort of state my 3 questions, okay? The second question was with respect to the regression analysis, which I really enjoyed looking at. And I think there is some scope for you to even possibly carve out a nice paper, publishable paper out of that empirical analysis. From what I understand, you were only looking at postponement of plans. By the way, it's the short form for logistical regressions is LOGIT, L-O-G-I-T, and I think in your title it came up as logic, L-O-G-I-C. So, but your logit regressions, from what I understand, were only dealing with the case at one point in time, right? In February and March of 2021. So you were not looking at the early part of the pandemic, just what happened later on in the 3rd wave of the pandemic. It might be fascinating if in a future research project, you might combine data from the first round and then the last round, was it Q2 and Q4 or Q1 and Q4? And the regression analysis would help you sort of focus more on what changed between the early part of the pandemic and the later part of the pandemic. As I said, this is very promising, and you might actually be able to write a publishable paper out of this. I found the analysis very, it's intuitive in many ways, but there are some interesting surprises as well. And generally, I want to just commend you for a great job.
Thank you, Dean. And hopefully I can answer some of the questions that you had. So in terms of race, I believe that was the first question. So we specifically wanted to look at the Inland Empire because there were some similar trends in the United States, California, LA, and San Francisco, but the Inland Empire was different. More research can be done, and that's something that could be considered within the literature review. As for the external factors on why that was the case for students or individuals who reported being white canceling their coursework at a higher rate, more can be done on that. I didn't find anything specifically onto what the reasoning was behind that, but the one thing that did stand out the most was students of color at first was not a big issue. And then as we get closer to week 24, we saw that those numbers spiked up and actually overpassed students who reported they were white. As for the second question, kind of the regression analysis, so it was kind of done in two parts. I definitely want to take the idea of doing a analysis at the beginning and now. So at the time, the analysis focuses from January to March, which was when I was actually doing the with my faculty advisor, the regression analysis and the interviews. But the descriptive analysis of the data, we wanted to look further back. And so that's why we looked at week 13 to week 24. And then as we got into March, that was week 27. So we just want to take the data from 2021 to kind of see that comparison in regards to the descriptive statistics from the previous slides.
Great, thank you. And by the way, when I commended you, I also wanted to commend your advisor who worked heroically with you.
Definitely, I could have done this without her, so I really want to give her a huge shout out, so thank you.
Yes, huge shout out to Ching Fong. Bruce Link, you had a question, and then Kurt, it'll be your turn next.
Is Bruce able to ask questions? Oh yeah, there it is.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Oh, so yeah, great presentation. I can almost make the same comment I made to the last group, the nice blending of the quantitative and the qualitative. It was really powerful. And I can also probably say great teamwork. You did a great job working with yourself, Alfredo.
Thank you.
I wanted to point out a couple things, and especially came through in the qualitative. And there's in the field of stress research, there's something called stress proliferation. It's the idea that one stressful circumstance cascades to infect the whole life circumstance of people in some ways. And I thought I saw that in some of your qualitative quotes. And so I just wanted to make that connection for you. And then the other thing I wanted to say about it is how important I think it is. And it's a lesson for all of us. And when we think about our school, the professors and the students are sometimes in very different circumstances. So the professors, have enough money and so on. And so the idea of needing to be able to put yourself in the shoes of others and see that they're engaged, they're trying to deal with this, we could call it stress proliferation or just the concrete words you had in those quotes. I think it's really important. And you're doing this, and later on this afternoon, a couple of my students did a survey that really enlightened me, and I think it's such an important thing. We should keep it in mind for the next pandemic. I just wanted to say that. I guess that's not a question, but I wanted to tell you that you had that impact on me. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Professor, and I appreciate the kind words. I found a lot of impact from the qualitative analysis when I did the interviews. I myself wanted to tear up at some of the interviews that I was doing with some students because it just shows a different level of impact than what the numbers will show. And you actually see the students, facing the challenges head on. So thank you for those comments, Dr. Lee.
You can see why the numbers are there.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, thanks.
Kurt, go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks. Actually, it's just a short comment. I'll keep it brief. It's I really enjoyed this presentation, and just I got to see kind of the evolution of it from when you started in the Capstone course during the start of the winter quarter, and you had a different idea, and you started down that path, and you realized that there was some roadblocks and barriers, and you did an amazing pivot, and you turned it into a really, really good product and output. So hats off to you and your advisor on this. And to all the first years that are listening out there, this is common, right? You start research, you start down one direction and you hit some roadblocks, and then you got to be clever and you pivot, but it can be done, and it can be done successfully, as Alfredo just showed here. So congratulations to you and your advisor. You did a great job.
Thank you, Dr. Schwabe.
Any final questions or comments from anybody? No? All All right, we are ahead of schedule. Thank you very much, Alfredo. And now I'm going to go ahead and bring
Thank you,
on
everyone.
our next group. Okay, we've got everyone here, it looks like. Great. So next up, we have Aisha, Brianna, and Michelle. Their capstone project will be discussing how state reproductive rights policies affect women and children's well-being. And their faculty mentor is Professor Dave Brady. So go ahead, take it away. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Can you guys hear me fine? Is everything okay? Okay. So hi, I'm in a group with Brianna and Michelle. So like Jolene just said, we are looking at how reproductive rights at the state level affect women and children's well-being. Next. So over the past couple of decades, there has been a rise in state policies constraining reproductive rights. Access to abortions and contraceptions have become increasingly more challenging for women of all ages. Studies have shown that when individuals have access to family planning and reproductive services, educational attainment outcomes, as well as physical and mental health outcomes, are projected to be better. For example, studies have shown that when adolescents are able to get an abortion, they are shown to not have an elevated risk of depression for up to 5 years after an abortion. With this known, our hypothesis then is restrictive reproductive policies ultimately have negative consequences against women and subsequently hinders them from being able to achieve better well-being outcomes. Next. So over the course of this presentation, we're going to be going over the objectives, the literature and existing evidence, the data and methodology that we use, and then the results and the conclusion.
So our objective is to identify how varying restrictive reproductive policies affect women and children's well-being. We just want to see certain policies and their effect on women's and children's welfare. So the literature and existing evidence includes the salience of reproductive rights. So why is this important? Why is this something that we need to pay attention to? So it is a global issue. The WHO has estimated that there were 21.6 million unsafe abortions conducted globally in 2008, and the number has steadily been rising. For example, despite safe access to legal abortions in Ghana, high rates of morbidity and mortality exist from attempted unsafe abortions. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean have shown to have some of the highest rates of abortion among women. So this is something that transcends the borders of the United States. It's something that affects everyone globally. It also directly affects women and children, and also indirectly affects men, families, single individuals. So regardless of your role in society, it's going to affect you in some way. Women's role in society as child rearers also greatly affects their health, which can adversely affect their children. And we found a lot of literature citing that the government has a special responsibility to support children and families with absent or lacking parents. So because of all of these reasons, we found our topic to be important.
And with the related research, we actually found that there were not a lot of similar studies to what we have been doing. So we shifted our focus instead to research regarding the policies that we are studying. And in this research, we found 3 common themes. So the first theme is that restrictions in abortion accessibility take many forms. One thing to note is that the Hyde Amendment bars states from using federal funding specifically for abortion, but states can. However, the Hyde Amendment does have exceptions in the case of rape, incest, or medical necessity. So these are the 3 criteria for which a state can use federal funding. Restrictions can take the form of either lack of Medicaid funding, so sometimes the state will not allocate it. Complexities in obtaining that funding, that's more so on the facility level. So when I say facility, I mean the facilities that perform these abortions. And notification and consent laws, both of these are also known as parental involvement laws. And studies have shown that when parental involvement does decrease a minor's demand for abortion, while state restrictions on Medicaid decrease by 9 to 17% on abortions. The second theme found is that we see improvement in various outcomes in reproductive empowerment and economic empowerment with access to contraception and services being family planning. Reproductive empowerment is the ability of women to make decisions regarding their fertility, sexuality, and full access to all reproductive services. Economic empowerment is the choice for women to work wherever and whenever they want. And studies show that early access and legal access to these types of services increase the number of women in the paid labor force. They are more likely to enroll in college. We see a lower welfare, less single parenthood, and less depression. And there are multiple studies citing this. The third theme is that insufficient knowledge of emergency contraception among pharmacists is the key indicator in whether or not a pharmacist will dispense emergency contraception. Some states leave it up to the pharmacist to decide whether or not they will do it. However, most pharmacists, they do not know how it works. They don't know the birth defects or health risks, and they're not comfortable in providing information to the patient about this topic. Studies specifically done in Florida and South Dakota show this. And the primary venue of receiving emergency contraception went from hospitals to pharmacists when the states decided to expand access to this medication.
Given all this information, we decided to choose the following policy variables. So the first policy we're looking at is whether or not Medicaid covers abortion. We also included a mirror for Arizona, which we'll discuss in a bit. The next policy we chose is the pharmacist's discretion in dispensing emergency contraception, which essentially looks at whether a state requires a pharmacist's prescription in order to obtain emergency contraception, like Plan B is nothing new. Additionally, we looked at the parental consent for minors abortion and then parental notification for minors abortion as our policies. We also wanted to have some control variables just to make sure that these weren't affecting our results. So we accounted for the population, which was gathered from the US Census Bureau, whether or not the governor is Democrat, the gross state product per capita, which was adjusted for population, the unemployment rate, as well as the union density. Next. So given the extensive scope of our analysis to acquire desired variables, we had to utilize multiple data sets and sources. So for our policy variables, we utilized the coalition state policy data set, as well as the national welfare data from the University of Kentucky. Our control variables were all acquired from the coalition state code book, except with the exception for the union density rate, which we acquired through Hirsch and McPherson. And then finally, we gather our outcome variables from the National Dimes, data provided by Adam Nicholson, and the national welfare data by the University of Kentucky. So the methodology behind this is then to map out the trends of all our policies and our outcome variables, two-way fixed effects models of policies, on the well-being variables with the state and the dummies, and then we also include the control variables. So like we mentioned before, Arizona was incorrectly coded, therefore we recoded it as 0 just to make sure that our data was all consistent. However, once we recoded it and created a mirror, we didn't find any significant differences. We also wanted to note South Dakota, where they do not follow the Hyde Amendment. So they only pay for abortions due to medical necessity, and rape and incest does not qualify under this. So they're the only state that is ignoring the federal mandate law. And then lastly, we also dropped DC from the study because of just lack of consistency of the policies through the data set. So we chose to just drop it.
So here are some figures of the policies that we generated. This first policy, Aisha mentioned earlier, it's abortion covered by Medicaid. Arizona is coded as 1 on the right, so that is the original data, and then Arizona is 0 on the left, which is the mirror. And as you can see here, we find this to be important because abortion not being covered by Medicaid excludes low-income individuals, in which their primary reliance on medical care is through Medicaid. So the graph shows that more states are covering abortion through Medicaid. As you can see, when the graph reaches around 2000, the year 2000, about 17 states in total have abortion covered by Medicaid. And even when Arizona is coded as one, there aren't any significant changes that we saw.
Sorry. And for figure 2, we see the number of states that do not require parental consent for a minor's abortion. We start at 46 states, and then we see a decrease until roughly about mid-2010s. It ends at about 22 to 23. We see that steep decrease from 1990 to 2000. So that means the amount of states that do require parental consent for a minor's abortion increases over time.
So here we can see another policy of parental notification not required for a minor's abortion. The number of states starts at around 46 and ends at 37. There's a steep decrease right before 1990 to 2000, then an increase in 2005, then back down after 2010. So there's a lot of variation with this particular policy, as this figure shows.
And here, this is the number of states in which a pharmacist cannot refuse contraceptives. So this is expanding accessibility. We start at 46, then decrease down to 38. This is important to note that this is without a prescription. It's stable until a little bit before 2000, then we decrease until the end of our data set, roughly around 2014. This means that the states that do require, states would require a prescription for emergency contraception. However, according to the World Health Organization, emergency contraception must be taken within the first 5 days. Otherwise, it is not as effective, if at all. So pharmacists can deny without prescription. And here is a list of all our well-being variables. So this would be our dependent variables. We have the national poverty rate, food stamp rate, and infant mortality rate. The national poverty rate is panel data on poverty. So this is the relative measure of 50% of median equivalent income, equivalized for household size. This includes cash income, income from Social Security, TANF, general assistance, unemployment insurance, and other measures. This also includes the TRIM3 model. One of the biggest problems in trying to measure poverty is that we see an underreporting of welfare transfers. So this TRIM3 model predicts welfare transfers that, or attempts to predict the ones that aren't reported. We have the food stamp rate. So the food stamp rate is just the number of people receiving SNAP benefits divided by the population times 100 to get that rate. And the infant mortality rate. So for this data set, an infant is counted towards this rate if the death occurs within the first year of life, and it is per 1,000 births.
So this is a table of the descriptives of our well-being variables. We have infant mortality rate, national poverty rate, and SNAP rate. As you can see, the infant mortality rate has the lowest standard deviation, meaning that our data tends to cluster right around the mean. There, for the most part, our overall data set hovers around the mean, and our N is just the number of cases that we had in our data set.
Now we'll go over the figures of each policy on our outcome variables. So here we're looking at each policy and its effect on the national poverty rate. So each graph will show a state that has more access to the entire data set versus a state that has less. That's what the lines represent. So the dashed line will be the liberalized version with the exception of the pharmacy. So in general, with this outcome variable, the national poverty rate sees a decline in the presence of these policies, except in the case where parental consent is required. This one in general is for the SNAP rate. So in general, with this outcome variable, the SNAP rate sees a decline in the presence of these policies, once again, except in the case where parental consent is required, meaning that when parental consent is required, there's an increase in SNAP rate. And then lastly, we look at the infant mortality rate and policies effect on the infant mortality rate. So with this outcome variable, we see a reduction in infant mortality rate in the presence of these policies once again. With once again the exception of consent being required. Additionally, it's important to note that in the bottom middle figure, we see parental notification, that when parental notification is required, the infant mortality is not as greatly affected. It just means there's not much of a difference when parental notification is required versus when it's not.
Okay, so here we have our two-way fixed effects models of well-being outcomes on policies. The first one we'll take a look at is the Medicaid coverage of abortion with controls from 1981 to 2014. The state and year dummies, we do this in order to account for as much in-group differences as possible because we are looking at national panel level data. That's what clustering and dummy variables are for. Here we can see that none of the outcomes are statistically significant, so they're all point estimates. Only the SNAP rate is in the hypothesized direction, so meaning when abortion is covered by Medicaid, SNAP rate per capita goes down by 0.181, and when we add controls, 0.0936. The rest is not in the generalized direction. Again, because these are not statistically significant, we cannot reject the hypothesis that the difference is statistically significant from 0. And here we have it for the Arizona mirror. So this is when Arizona is coded as 0. Again, there is not much that changes. Nothing is statistically significant. Only SNAP rate is in the hypothesized direction again. And it's a 0.392 decrease. So in magnitude, it's a little bit bigger. So it is interesting to note that, especially when we only consider that like one state makes a difference. And the rest, again, is not in the generalized direction.
So here we have parental consent not required for an abortion. So when parental consent isn't required, the poverty rate is statistically significant by negative 1.260. So it does decrease. However, when added in with controls, it becomes statistically insignificant, meaning that our model is not robust enough. A SNAP rate is also in the hypothesized direction, negative, and it is statistically significant, but at a very low p-value with controls, but without controls, it is not. Infant mortality rate is in the positive direction, but neither are statistically significant. So the direction of infant mortality is positive and increases by 0.0733 without controls and 0.599 with controls, which are quite small in comparison to the others. Okay, continue. And then the next we have when parental notification is not required. So as you can see here as well, none of the results are statistically significant. Poverty rate is in the hypothesized direction, whereas SNAP rate is not. It actually increases when parental notification is not required. Poverty rate reduces by negative 0.387 and negative 0.258 with controls. SNAP rate actually increases, but none of and infant mortality rate also increases, but none of our results are statistically significant.
And here we have it as pharmacists that cannot refuse to distribute contraceptives with controls. We see that none are statistically significant again, so they are all point estimates. If pharmacists cannot refuse, then only poverty rate without controls goes down is 0.221, and the rest go in the opposite direction. Again, nothing is statistically significant, so we cannot say that it does have an effect. So just a general slide of our results. We see a reduction in reproductive rights. Less states cover abortion through Medicaid. Less states do not require parental consent. Less states do not require parental notification. And less states do not require prescription for hormonal birth control, so that emergency contraceptive. So our chosen policies do not have a significant effect on poverty, SNAP rate, and infant mortality rate. And we fail to support our initial hypothesis.
So our conclusions for this study is that there is a dramatic increase in states that can constrain accessibility to reproductive services. The two-way fixed effects model is not robust enough because it's statistically significant with controls, without controls in some areas, but there's no consistency in significance when added or removed with some. The policy implications we found is that it's important for policymakers to continue searching for the causes of these well-being indicators. So researchers may be able to rule these out as effects of these certain well-being outcomes. And it's evident that the research surrounding this topic is very limited. So more research is needed to know what does affect the poverty rate, SNAP rate, and the infant mortality rate. And with that, that concludes our presentation. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Thank you, everyone. I'd now like to open it up for Q&A from the audience. Feel free to go ahead and raise your hand if you have any questions. Okay, Bruce, go ahead. Oh, wait, I gotta unmute you, Bruce. Hang on. Oh, no, you should be good, Bruce.
Okay, thanks for that presentation. Very nicely presented. It's so clear how you did that. I was wondering about, I might have missed it, but the reason for the dependent variables that you picked as the outcomes, was it because you're interested in them and whether these policies might influence them, or did you pick them because they're the most likely thing that these policies might impact? Was a question I had. I think it's really important to know the null findings. So there's that. And I wondered whether or not, I'd be interested to know whether these policies have the intended consequence of reducing abortion. You know, that'd be interesting to me too. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
I can talk a little bit about that. So when we were initially choosing our dependent variables, we wanted to choose, we say well-being outcomes a lot, and it's our reproductive rights policies. As Michelle stated in the intro, it does affect not just women and children, but it does affect men. It affects everyone in society. So these types of well-being outcomes were more so trickle-down effects, and we wanted to test the effects of the reproductive rights policies on these particular outcomes because they're not explicitly linked to them. So we just wanted to see the effects on that.
I also wanted to add in that I know that you asked if these policies had the intention of reducing the number of abortions. I mentioned earlier that there's several unsafe abortions that happen. So I think it's more so that they're reducing the number of unsafe abortions because regardless, abortions are going to happen. And so the purpose is to make sure that they're just more safe than risking morbidity and mortality with unsafe ones.
Okay, good, thanks.
Professor Danieri, and then Anil after that.
Thank you. This was a really fascinating presentation about a topic that's pretty far from my expertise. But I have a couple of related questions about, the fact that you didn't find a significant relationship between poverty and abortion. And I want to maybe throw out some thoughts on why that might be. But the first one is to clarify whether which direction you anticipate the causal relationship going in. Whether we think access to abortion should have an impact on poverty levels, or whether we think that poverty levels have an impact on abortion. Because at least some research that I know of, and I know of very little, right, indicates that poverty is actually a big determinant of whether people seek abortions, largely because it impacts their access to other forms of birth control. But then the other question is just with poverty as a dependent variable. I wonder if it's just that there are so many causes of poverty in this country that abortion is just going to get sort of lost, overwhelmed by other causes of poverty in the mix. And so I'd be curious what you think about those things.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And what you said makes sense. So like there's probably a varying amount of factors that result in poverty. So maybe that's why abortion didn't have a significant effect on it.
I would say you do raise good points. And initially we thought that if abortion was going to be covered by the state's Medicaid, that national poverty rate would go down because studies show that when women have access to these types of family planning services, they are more likely to enroll in college. They're more likely to be in the labor force, and they have overall better mental health outcomes. Martha Bailey, who we cited a lot in our paper, does a lot of studies in regards to legal access to emergency contraception, to the pill, and whether or not women participate in the labor force. So that was our link to using the national poverty rate there as well.
Paul, do you have any follow-up questions?
No, I mean, my questions are things we could argue about all day long because we don't have significant effects. I think one thing might be interesting to think about in terms of the the overall likely explanatory effect on poverty would have to do with, even in the states where abortion is most accessible, I'm guessing that the numbers of abortions performed are a fairly small number related to the overall number of people or the overall number of people even in poverty. And so again, just the likelihood that it's going to have some explanatory purchase on poverty rates overall, it just seems to me that numerically it's not likely to be the case. And again, I think it's also equally likely that the relationship goes in the other direction. But that's just to repeat what I said before. I don't think there's, again, we could argue about it all day. So.
Thank you. Anil, and then Professor Brady will be next.
Notice Jolene always refers to me as Anil, and everyone else gets the title professor. Anyway, I really enjoyed your presentation. It is amazing what you have been able to achieve, putting together this panel data for states over something like what, how many, 40 years almost, 30 plus years. And doing the kind of analysis that you did. I saw your presentation just 2 weeks ago, and you've come a long way just even within the last 2 weeks. So, congratulations to all of you for doing this amazing work, and congratulations to your advisor for guiding you in the right way. Couple of quick questions. One, I noticed that you included all your policy intervention variables one by one in your models, not all together. Typically, when we look at the a whole set of interventions and how they affect behavioral outcomes, we tend to include all of them along with control variables. Were you worried that there was a lot of multi-collinearity or correlation amongst these different policy variables? And is that why you decided to include them separately, one at a time? Or did you ever try including all 4 of those variables simultaneously in your regression? So that was my first question, which is more of a technical question. And then the second question was, I share some of the concerns and the questions that came up from Professor Link and Professor Danieri about whether you might want to, instead of looking at well-being indicators like poverty, whether it might make more sense to focus on outcome variables that we think have a more direct connection to these policy interventions. Things like, I don't know if there's data on safe deliveries or on maternal mortality rate. I like the infant mortality rate variable that you treated as a dependent variable. But I believe there is also state level data on the percentage of underweight babies, underweight infants that are born. So perhaps sort of focusing on more of these reproductive outcome variables might be better if you decide to take this research further. And in terms of well-being, again, I don't know, but your advisor would certainly know whether such data exists. But I know that there are all these happiness indices that have been data on happiness indicators that have been collected by across countries over time. And I don't know if such a data set exists for the United States across states and over time. But you might even explore whether, to the extent that some of these policies affect people's sense of well-being, their perception of well-being, whether it might be possible to sort of look at a happiness outcome or a happiness indicator as your dependent variable. So all of my suggestions, and in fact, I would say Professor Link's and Professor Daniel's suggestions are from the point of view of future research that you might want to take up. And I would strongly encourage you to pursue this line of research in whatever else you do in the future, because you have embarked upon a very fascinating and important topic. So great job. You have just done a phenomenal job in terms of the sheer amount of work and the perception that you have brought to your analysis.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Oh, so to answer your first question about co-linearity, we ran several of the analyses we ran several more than the ones that we have here with certain controls, without certain controls, with each variable, or with each outcome variable, and we found that the results were generally the same. We actually mentioned that in our paper. We talk about the robustness of the analyses, and then the way we presented it, we just felt visually it was cleaner this way, and that's how we also presented in our paper as well, because having just the really the tables, it seemed like it would be too much for each slide. So that's the way we presented it. But we did run several more analyses and indicated that in our paper to make sure that generally our findings were pretty much the same when we ran it different ways.
Additionally, the reason we chose the outcome variable we did and not within the reproductive realm was because we wanted to see the effects of our policies on different parts of well-being in a woman and child's life, not just limited to just happiness or the I guess, assumed outcomes that you would think would be affected by reproductive rights. We wanted to explore this outside the scope of it, like Bree mentioned, to see if there's a trickle-down effect on things like poverty and SNAP, right? And to really determine if there's a correlation between, restrictive policies and overall quality of life. So that's what we were trying to encompass, is not just narrowing our outcomes to reproductive sort of birth weight sort of outcomes, but things outside of that as well, to see if there's a connection.
And with if I might add, the maternal mortality data, we had looked at it initially as a dependent variable. However, upon further research, we found that there is actually a gap from, I believe, I can't remember the top of my head, but it was a significant gap, I believe 10 years. And the reason for that gap was because they just stopped recording that data. And then when they picked it up again, I believe it's in the early 2010s, they actually changed how they coded a maternal death. So before it was, I believe, the first 6 months, and now it was the first 2 months, or a different criteria. But that is the reason we chose not to include maternal mortality.
Great, thank you.
Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to echo those guys' sentiments. Like, it was really striking how little data there is over time and across states in maternal health and well-being. I would have thought, surely we can get maternal mortality, morbidity over time. And even infant mortality by state year ended up being really, really hard to find. And Rich Carpiano sort of saved us with this March of Dimes data set. So I was really shocked that the government doesn't track infant mortality by state year, unless you want to go get to the records yourself and do it yourself. So it was really striking just how the dearth of good well-being outcomes for mothers and babies across states and over time. It's sort of a weird thing. We don't study that. Anyway, but yeah, so we didn't find big results on the well-being outcomes. But the big story to me was this. I mean, I admit I wasn't fully aware how dramatic the reduction in access has been over time. Like, you guys show it in these trends of like just massive expansion of policies cutting back women's reproductive rights. And I was just wondering, this would be more of like a political science capstone than public policy capstone, but do we understand what's causing this? I mean, aside from what we read in the New York Times, like, have there been good studies that show, it's partisan composition of state legislators, or it's women's political turnout, or what is predicting and causing this massive expansion of restrictions on women's rights? Do we understand that?
I don't think so. I mean, yeah, it's not safe for us to presume it's because of, like, obviously we can account recent stuff to, like, the Trump era and whatnot, but this has been consistently declining for years. So there's no saying what the actual causes are. At least we weren't able to find it.
Like, and even as we went through our study, there's just such a wide gaps in data. it's very difficult to be able to track completely. Yeah, I know when Bree mentioned the maternal mortality, I think it was, or it was more than 10 years that was missing, and we ended up having to scrap that variable because it was just too much, and there's no reasonable way for us to get that data in time. So yeah, there's so many gaps in the like just the known data, and that can make it really challenging to be able to find the connection, the links.
I guess in response to Dave's question, yes, I think that there's one variable that can explain this restrictive abortion rights perfectly. That's the vast increase in the number of Republican-controlled state legislatures over the last 20 years. That probably explains this perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, there's also some sort of contamination or diffusion process too, right? Because the states are sharing legislation across states. So it's spilling like a contamination. It's like one state adopts it and then 20 others do. It really had this domino effect quality. And it was really remarkable, actually, just to see the massive decline of access over time. Bruce has a question, I think.
Yeah, I love the question that Dave brought up, and your presentation really, drives it forward. And I wonder whether sort of the threat to male dominance could be behind it at all, and in the workplace and all that kind of thing. Because controlling women is what's going on, and it's mainly men that are doing it in these legislatures. And so you have to get in their heads and what's troubling them about their lives, and are they losing, the power they once had? And I don't know, that's speculation, but I think it's been raised in the sociological literature some. I think it's super interesting.
Yeah, that is fascinating, actually. Yeah. And you see the same thing with restrictive voting rights now. So I guess there's some sort of a grievance. Either if people talk about it as white grievance, or you are talking about it as male grievance.
Yeah. Well, and then the voting went, that the strong Republican voting for this populist, anti-feminist, multiculturalism stuff is mainly male, or there's the big gender gap. So there is something about that group, and so I don't know.
All right, any final questions before we wrap this session up?
Great job. And you should continue with some of this research.
Yeah.
Okay, with that, we will be taking a half-hour break. So we will be back at 2:30. You can just stay on the Zoom link. Just please mute your microphone, and of course, turn off your video. So we will see everyone back here at 2:30. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We'll be getting started in a couple minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone. It's 2:30. So I am going to now be turning it over to our next group of students. So we have Danielle and Penny, and they will be discussing the determinants of undergraduate student stress, and their faculty mentor is Professor Bruce Link. So Danielle and Penny, go ahead and take it away.
Hi everyone, my name is Payal and my team member is Daniel, and we're working with Professor Lin, and our Capstone project is determining of the undergraduate student stress. First, let me introduce the background of our research project. The rationale of this project is developing amid the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown policy that will implement in many states, including California. UCR is in response to the pandemic. It also virtually shut down their campus and adopt online teaching in the second half 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic had significant psychological impact on individual students. On the one hand, a fear of getting infected leads to increased level and anxiety and depression. On the other hand, this negative emotion were featured by social association under the lockdown policy. Besides, university students are believed to even have experienced more anxiety. Because they encounter additional difficulties related to their study, we all know how remote teaching and learning were at the start of adoption. The usually disrupted internet connection, the lack of face-to-face interact, and other technology issue or the student academic programs. For this affected students, those who are social minority groups such as Asian were even more affected, because the racial discrimination in America is associated during the lockdown, especially under the Donald Trump administration. For the research objective, we admit the pinpoint distinct issue the student facing could be global crisis. COVID-19 will service undergraduate students at the university student and the University of California, Riverside for the reason that they are particularly various groups in terms of stress, and they are balanced their academics, possibly like the career, finance, or the regular stress and anxiety of living in terms of pandemic. Students are additionally invested in themselves, the public institution and feature of their community by study for career. The central question of the study is whether these stress are associated with anxiety and depression. The second element is explore whether particularly as group or classification of students could be experienced more hardship than others. We will then suggest a policy recommendation that may help students with the stressful or experience then intercount with their university and beyond. For the research question, we have the four right here. The first is what COVID-related factor contributed to student stress. Second is which COVID-related stress are most significant. The third is do the buffering effect of the value on stress response different between the social groups. And the last one is what the policy recommendation can be made to reduce student stress during the pandemic and epidemic. For research design, the research design has following design. It's used for data and information. The research involved both the primary research and secondary research. In the primary research, it's online survey. Online survey is used to obtain data from students at UCR. The surveys contain questions that connect responsive personal descriptive data such as gender, age, and race, measure their stress level using international stress scale, like called the GAD-7, and gather their views regarding policy recommendation. In the secondary research, various literature regarding young stress and social association were reviewed. Also relevant government document and communicate programs, also the university rules were examined. By combining the result from primary and secondary research regarding student response stress are identified and compared to existing serious and framework. Literature review. From the literature review, it is found that lockdown policy led to the significant increase in the general public perceiving level of stress. Social association on the lockdown is found to be key factor contribute to the stress level of young adults. Also, loneliness and stress of young adults significant increase during the pandemic, as exemplified by increased stress score and demand for mental health care. Despite that, some scholars show that young adults may be more negative psychological impact of COVID-19. Additionally, a social minority suffer more from COVID-related stress and depression.
Okay, so here we have an overview of our sample. We performed an analysis on a total of 158 undergraduate UCR students from 2 different classrooms. So as you can see, the typical age range from 21 to 23-ish, but we did have a wide variety of different ages from 20 to 64. For employment status, most of the students were out of work and not looking, so I guess we can assume they were living comfortably at home. Then we have students working for pay, out of work and looking, self-employed, unable to work, and very few were homemakers. A majority of the students were female in comparison to their male or non-binary counterparts. And then we had a large amount of seniors, juniors, very few sophomores, and no freshmen. So although this sample may not be representative of the entire UCR population, we did have some very interesting results. So we had 2 measures to determine student stress level during the pre-COVID period and a post-COVID period because we wanted to compare the 2. So first, here's the post-COVID period where we ask students to think about their thoughts and feelings during the past month where the survey was administered. So an example of a stress question is, how often in the past month have you been upset because of something that happened unexpectedly? And the student would self-report a score of 1 to 5, in which 1 is never and 5 would be very often. Okay, similarly, we have the exact same Cohen questionnaire asking the exact same questions, but we're just asking students to think retrospectively prior to the outbreak of the pandemic. And they're measured in the same, in which 1 is low frequency and 5 is high frequency. And as you can see from our results, stress levels did rise from the pre-COVID to post-COVID period. And so in our research, we would like to determine what factors contributed to this stress and which groups of students were more vulnerable to stressors. So in this slide, you can see that stress levels weren't distributed equally amongst different groups of students. So we compared first generation students to non-first generation students. And you could see there is a large gap between the rise in stress levels amongst these 2 groups. So it's important to consider that there are some students that may be more vulnerable to stress during this time because they have particular circumstances, maybe due to their ethnicity or background and things like that. We also wanted to look at students' anxiety and depression levels. So what we did is we used the Patient Health Questionnaire for General Anxiety Disorder, also known as the PHQ-9 GAD-7. And this includes 9 questions regarding depression and 7 questions regarding anxiety. So they are both scaled the same. Students will self-report how frequently they feel anxious or depressed. So an example, it's asking, over the last 2 weeks, how often have you felt little interest or pleasure in doing things? If a student reports 0, they will say not at all. But if they report a high score of 3, they feel those depression and anxiety symptoms nearly every day. So here we have a result of students experiencing high anxiety levels and high depression levels. And we defined high anxiety and depression as a score of over 2, or a score where students experience stress for more than half the days or nearly every day. So 42% of students were experiencing high anxiety, and 36 students reported experiencing high depression. So I just want to point out, these are very high amounts of students in our sample experiencing high levels of anxiety and depression. This isn't the total amount of students experiencing anxiety and depression, it's just those experiencing high anxiety and depression. But this is a very fair amount of students, so we should consider the factors causing high anxiety and depression and the fact that they're psychologically distressed during this time. So we developed our own measures of strain in order to determine what factors are influencing student anxiety and depression levels. So these are just a few that we found to be statistically significant, and we created a scale. So a few of the independent variables I'll read off are difficulty finding a quiet space, the frequency of interruptions at home, whether or not your family or household is understanding of your school or work responsibilities, and whether you're feeling conflicts at home. So we created a standardized scale of strain from 1 to 4, in which 1 is a low level of strain and 4 is a high level of strain. And what we did is we ran multiple regression analysis in order to determine how strain impacts anxiety and depression levels. So here are our results, and although this is a graph, they're consistent with the results of our regression, even if we controlled for other variables. So you can see as strain, as the measures of strain that we came up with increased amongst students, so did their levels of anxiety and depression. So you can see the students experiencing the highest level of strain at 4, experience anxiety levels at 2.769 out of a score of 3. So that's extremely high. And it's safe to assume that these are truly the factors contributing to students' high anxiety and depression. So for depression, similarly, as strain levels increased, so did their depression levels, and students averaged 2.589 out of 3 for depression. So again, this is a very high level of depression, and it's safe to say that we can assume these are the factors contributing to their mental distress. We also asked students directly on our survey what policies they would like to see in order to help mitigate the symptoms they're experiencing. So the most heavily endorsed policy by students, which is probably no surprise, is they ask for financial relief. And what I found to be very interesting is dependent students endorse this more so than independent students. And I find this interesting because dependent students, or students that are claimed on their parents' taxes, they were ineligible for 2 out of 3 of the federally distributed stimulus checks. So they weren't getting as much government assistance in comparison to their independent counterparts. And again, this is the most heavily endorsed policy. The least endorsed policy by students was curriculum re-evaluation. We actually found students were pretty comfortable with distant learning in the sample, but it was still heavily endorsed. And there can be some issues regarding students' academic success during this time. But the other policy options that we proposed to students, such as providing additional resources for the digital divide, or if students are lacking the necessary materials for their academic success, or if they're having issues in home life and need support, basically those policy recommendations fell in between the most endorsed and the least endorsed policies by students.
Yeah, for the policy recommendations, basically on the funding, 2 policy recommendations are proposed to feature release students' stress level during the pandemic. The first one is proposed like the university, specifically the university recommended to establish mentoring programs where each student is assigned a mentor based on their major, self-evaluate personal performance. The mentor will provide study and life advice to the student, hopefully become their reliable pen during the pandemic. It would be create a sense of social support, helping mitigate students perceiving difficult in completing their course. But there is one potentially difficult with this recommendation. The university needed to fund the sufficiency capable people to their mentors. And it made it difficult to do that because they consider with the size of the student at UCR or the other university, it may require the university to collaborate with its communities. And for second policy recommendation, since students from the social mental risk are more the COVID-related stress, the university should provide priority support to these students who are suffering from the mental distress and anxiety. For example, given that demand for the mental health concern service so high, since these students have already perceived racially and social unfair treatment, the university may mitigate their perceived unfairness. So I think the university promoting their overall the mental health. So that's all our Capstone presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to open it up to questions from the audience.
I can ask a question.
Thank you.
Is it okay? Yeah. Great presentation, Daniel and Penny. I can't believe you have to get the prize for the most improved capstone within the last 4 weeks. I mean, looking at where you were 4 weeks ago and where you are now, you have done an incredible amount of progress. And I really like the way you presented your results, you nuanced your findings. I think this is a great job, and you did a lot with the data that you had available on hand. So I think interviewing those 8 students, developing your own, measures of stress, all phenomenal analysis and very innovative and creative capstone. So congratulations. Specific question for you. I like the fact that you ask students to sort of look at their stress, to imagine their stress or anxiety level or depression sort of before the pandemic and then currently when you interviewed them. This again, you interviewed the students in winter quarter of 2021, or when exactly was this?
No, we didn't interview students. We just did a quantitative survey through Qualtrics.
Yeah, but interviewed meaning, yeah, you did get the, but that was in winter of 2021, right? Just like a few months ago.
Yeah, actually, I think it was like spring, I think when the beginning of spring quarter when we first distributed the survey.
And it's very interesting that you found that the anxiety levels had increased significantly more from before the pandemic and during the pandemic for first generation students than for others. I would have also liked to see that those data broken down by gender or by minority status, whether I don't know if you had enough of a sample size to look at different minority groups, but it would be very interesting to see if who were the students who experienced this big increase in anxiety and depression as a result of the pandemic. I wonder, your regression results are very interesting too, but I wonder to what extent you can really treat their perceived stress levels on those 4 different indicators. I forget what those 4 indicators were, but financial problems and understanding by the family, whether you can view those as explanatory or independent variables and look at the effect of those variables on anxiety or depression. There's sort of a lot of, it's not clear which one is causing which. And so I think when you show your results, you might need to be more careful about saying that these the 2 sets of indicators, the anxiety, depression on the one hand, and the stressors on the other hand, are correlated, and there's no causal connection necessarily between those 2 sets of variables. But overall, you have, I really also like your policy recommendation of having mentors. And I, as Professor Schwabe and I have told you before, we can, it might be good for you to present some of this work to our university authorities and sort of see whether there might be some policies that they might think about based on your analysis and on your findings. Okay, so overall, great job. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Bruce. Oh, unmute. Hang on, we can unmute you, Bruce.
Oh, I don't know. I wanted to say some stuff. I wanted to say basically how proud I am of these 2 and what they did, because they created their own project, and it was a creative project in the sense that I'm not sure quite how they did it, but the task before them was to try to figure out what really got under the skin of students, and probably some of their own experience. And they articulated these. I had nothing to do with it. They went off and created these ideas and then made up the scale. They didn't have time to tell you that it came out with a good reliability, which sometimes it takes me years to make a good reliable scale. Well, they did it just in this project. And that creative aspect, I thought about how important, sometimes we wonder about how, we always talk about diversity and how we have to have diversity of perspectives. Well, diversity of perspectives from people from different backgrounds and then students, they really brought to bear and brought out for other people to see what is likely most troubling about this circumstance for students. And then I gave it to my class, and then I got to talk to my class about it, and they just loved it because it told their story. And so there's that, and then they had to go all through the IRB and all that, and create their own data. I just think they did a great job. And some of the things that Anil, you brought up, one of the reasons that we were interested in seeing about the social circumstances of people is because that's less likely to be reverse causation. If you're first gen, your anxiety is not going to make you first gen, but then that relates to your stress. So some of the stress comes from that social location, we're pretty sure. So that was part of their setup too, that they might not have had enough time to talk about. But anyways, and I also agree with Anil that this is something that I think the university would do well to know about, because it's easy not to understand these things if you don't experience them. And these two brought it to life. Sorry, couldn't help it.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Good job, you two.
Any other questions or comments from anyone in the audience or any of the panelists? No?
Yeah,
All right. Oh,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead, Kurt.
Yeah, this is just Kurt again. Again, you know, this project started out, you know, you had your challenges again, and you just pivoted so well and did such a great job on this. Really useful outcomes here. And hats off to you for your consistent and persistent efforts in making a really high quality product. Thanks a lot. So it was a pleasure to watch that evolution.
All right. Thank you very much, Danielle and Penny. Up next, we have Fabian and Francisco. Their topic will be COVID-19 disruptions in local social services, an analysis of Riverside County and implications for public policy. And their faculty mentor is Professor Bruce Link. So Fabian and Francisco, you are up.
Hello, everyone. I believe Fabian's screen sharing.
Yeah, give me 1 second and I will share my screen.
How many projects was Bruce the Capstone mentor on?
2.
All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Francisco, and I was in a group with Fabian, and obviously our mentor was Dr. Bruce Link. And we wanted, our project is called COVID-19 Disruptions in Local Social Services, an analysis of Riverside County and implications for public policy. And then if you could just skip to the next one. There we go. Oh, all right. So why look at social services? So social services provide public assistance that lift county residents out of poverty while producing revenues for the local economy. State and federal funds pay for 95% of public assistance programs. So governmental responses do influence the way that counties provide services for their constituents. Social services, or I'm sorry, COVID-19 had proportionally impacted the accessibility of services to many sectors that serve these populations by limiting operations and outreach to community members, especially those with pre-existing limited access. And then just these two data points are kind of like a screenshot of current, or sorry, 2018 data on in-home supported services used by seniors or individuals aged 65 and up, as well as CalFresh participants enrolled in 1, 2, 3 or more programs. And then just an unduplicated number that was provided to us by Riverside County. So Riverside County residents utilized these services in fiscal year 2019 to 2020 for a total of 992,374 county residents. And you can, all right. So customer participation is usually how they refer to program participation. So it went up in the fiscal year. The fiscal year report is usually from mid-July, obviously to the next year in mid-July as well. Customer participation had went up by 24%, even when you take into account that the fiscal year began then, a couple months after the pandemic had started. So self-service utilization services were introduced by the county following COVID-19 shutdowns. And this is kind of what we have highlighted in our data right here. Welfare benefits approval did increase overall, and we did highlight welfare benefits as a result of unemployment measures taken by state and federal government. However, we did notice that for children's welfare services and adult protective services, there was an increase over the county's subdivision assessments. So we see that in child welfare services, there was an increase on home visits. There was a decrease into home investigations, with notable differences in re-abuse and foster care reentry reporting. And then for adult protective services, we saw an increase in visits as well, investigations too, as well as re-abuse and maltreatment in home supportive services for the year. Workforce training did increase for staff who had already had high staff to case ratio, but we do highlight formal coaching because the training aspect does refer to institutional training as opposed to resource coaching and bias training. Telework did increase throughout the fiscal year, as noted by our interview with the Director of Department of Public Social Services. And then with this data, it does become clear that COVID-19 disproportionately affect the accessibility of these services that have largely consisted of Latinx populations, women and children, and individuals aged 16 to 64. All right. And so with our issue at hand, our objective of the study was to gain an understanding of how the pandemic's impact affected social services in Riverside County. Specifically, we wanted to look at need-based services that COVID-19 affected because of in-gathering restrictions. So this included looking at mental health services, food and nutritional assistance, temporary housing programs, women and children services, and services for seniors and individuals with disabilities. Our goal was to develop a comprehensive analysis using a variation of data and using it to create a policy implication approach model to avoid service disruptions in a communicable and infectious disease environments like COVID-19. All right, so this is quite the list, but because our study did require a full comprehensive analysis on different sectors, I'm so sorry, that is my dog. Our literature and data obtainment included looking at each service sector, analyzing trends over time, governmental responses at the state and federal level, as well as guidance from the agencies that the Department of Public Social Services works with to provide these services for Riverside County residents. In doing so, we're able to understand the ways that COVID-19 decreased accessibility or quality of services, and we used it to make policy implications. So our study aimed at emphasizing prevention efforts and integration of community-based engagement. And so for our methodology, we analyzed a total of 23 organizations, state programs, and county offices, as well as 22 publications regarding COVID-19 response plans, county communications regarding operations, data sets, and policy-related guidance. And then we had a heavy emphasis on data retrieved by the California Health and Human Services data portal, which is what you saw at the beginning of the presentation. We did also look at the 2019 Community Health Needs Assessment conducted by Kaiser Health Foundation. We looked at California, their blueprint for reopening the state, and in order to gauge tier progress within the county and vaccination efforts as well. We also looked at the time series metrics by the County Department of Child Protective Services, as well as using our interview with Sayori Baldwin, the director of the Department of Social Services. And I believe that's it. All right, so based on the data that we had gathered, I am so sorry. Okay, I'm so sorry about that. So for the implications of our public policy, we advocate for an establishment of contracts between the Department of Public Social Services, non-congregate shelters, and workforce development agencies, while also partnering with these workforce agencies in order to hire individuals. This is kind of one of the bigger policy implications that we had to invest back into the community. Community participation is heavily contingent upon trust, and communal members who have used these services have firsthand experience and can become better prepared for the workforce after these housing programs. It also eliminates the need to hire externally and invest in community member experiences to guide housing program initiatives, as well as we advocated for expansion of mental health services through telehealth and other virtual programming, like the Friendship Line, which is a hotline for seniors struggling with depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideations. We also looked at improving internal coaching and bias training for service agencies in order to provide social adjustment programs for individuals in in-home supportive services, child welfare services, and individuals with disabilities as well. We also advocated for investment of data sharing and processing technology for the county in order to improve application processing, monitoring trends in program participation, and updating community needs. Community-based forums, also because these were the biggest recommended approaches in the policy guidances that we observed. And then we also advocate for using TFAP, which is the, I'm so sorry.
Hey, Francisco, it's not as bad for us as it is for you. Your dog.
So sorry, he's running around.
Don't worry. You're not distracted.
But we advocated towards using TFAP existing relationships with DPSS to build a triad of partnerships between these two organizations and food assistance agencies. For example, one of the data that we had looked at was the Project Dash from DoorDash. In 2020, they had delivered 6.5 million meals throughout the US. And we thought that the idea of creating these partnerships and replicating them could facilitate easier access to home essentials for individuals, especially those who use in-home supportive services as well.
All right, so that brings us to outcomes. So basically, what were the outcomes of our project? Well, number one is we definitely need to strengthen the baseline. We need to increase the accessibility of services. We saw how the pandemic affected the issues in accessibility in terms of bandwidth and technology. You know, if you're utilizing a lot of social services, you're probably in a position where it's hard to obtain technology in the first place, let alone paying for rent or paying for internet. Another outcome that we're looking to achieve is have more efficient data processing and trend monitoring. Now, this comes just from noticing the difference between a rural community and a city, for example, where they do have access to more resources. However, there are incidences in which one can utilize the services of another area, and then it's reported for that area rather than where they came from. We're also looking to increase community engagement to provide more accurate needs assessments. Through our interview, we did identify that community engagement and community input isn't really taken into account at the higher levels when discussing what programs to implement. And then we're also looking to increase engagement between local providers. That's something that I've noticed just through my exposure in my workplace, seeing that a lot of the providers don't have communication among each other, and they're duplicating work often, or even just overlapping work that's already been done. So some of the challenges and responses that we already knew prior to COVID-19 was that there's a high issue with stigma in the use of social services, and also a high case to staff ratio. During the pandemic, we started to identify that the major issues had to do with accessibility and a poor government response as well when it came to the pandemic. You know, looking at how long it took for payments to come from the federal government to households in order to alleviate the stress of the furloughs and job loss. So as part of our responses, we're looking to, number one, be able to facilitate services in the event of another pandemic taking place. Hopefully that is not the case, but we want to be more prepared next time. And our research and our literature review is projecting a greater need and a heavier reliance on these services just based off of the pandemic alone. So with our interview with Sayuri Baldwin, that's her right there, pictured. Thank you again, Dr. Schwabe, for making that introduction, because that would not have been possible on such a short notice. But through our conversations with her, she did identify that workforce was an issue as far as training goes, but also that the workforce capacity, it didn't really increase to match the rate of unemployment as it did go up during the pandemic. We also had conversations surrounding stigma, that there's still a lot of stigma occurring, and one possible way to alleviate that is to utilize individuals who have had to go through social services or utilize these services to help reduce the stigma, as they'll be more open and receptive to communicating with the populations that they serve. Equitable planning. So this is, in my opinion, the biggest takeaway, because what wasn't taken into account was, if you're dealing with housing insecure individuals and you want to continue to facilitate services with them, how do you do so if you can't reach them? There's no address. If you close down your office, how do you stay in touch with them? So that was a big issue. And then Francisco did touch on this briefly, but child welfare was another big issue as well. As you know, any teacher or anybody that's registered with the county or the state must report any kind of abuse that they see, among their students. And what happened was we saw the reports go down because as the school districts closed, there was no one there to report the abuse. And even worse was whenever social workers did try to enter households, all the family had to say was that someone had a fever, someone was experiencing basically any COVID-19 symptom, and they could not come into the household. So it presented a lot of issues. And then even just taking into account at-risk populations. So we saw how, the elderly were more at risk, but there wasn't a plan for them to facilitate virtual services. And we all know that the age gap is going to be difficult to teach the older community how to use Zoom, for example, or operate an iPad and so forth. And lastly, but definitely not least, there's not enough of a focus on prevention. We don't really focus on how do we prevent individuals from becoming homeless or becoming food insecure. We have programs that deal with the matter after the fact. So once they are homeless and once they are food insecure, and the same goes with job loss as well. But one of the biggest takeaways as well from our interview was that we realized there's a direct relationship between unemployment and social services, meaning that as unemployment increases or goes up, there's a higher need or reliance on social services as well. And one thing that Sayori did echo that we also feel is crucial is increasing our grassroots and outreach, increasing the grassroots connection to the community, building that trust so that we can facilitate these services easier and hopefully reducing resistance and reducing stigma as well. But she did note that there was an increase in applicants during COVID-19 when we looked at CalFresh applications, TANF, and unemployment as well. And so for our conclusion, we are looking at bringing in an intersectional approach to improving social services in general. We want to focus on prevention rather than after the fact methods, and prioritizing individuals with multiple dependencies. So taking into account that there are individuals that probably are on housing assistance, probably are on unemployment as well, probably are, food insecure and receiving assistance in that regard. And what are we doing to invest and understand the individual's situation to migrate them out of that situation? So taking a sustainable approach to ensure that it's not a cycle that we see, but more of a progression out of this tier. The workforce inclusive of peers. So that in the sense, meaning that your workforce includes individuals who have gone through the process. So it's easier for them to communicate with the population that they are serving and helping reduce stigma. Trauma-informed approach. So recognizing that we do need mental health specialists, we do need sociologists and psychologists interacting and being invested in these different sectors as well, and even serving as like monitors for like temporary housing and even just food assistance services. But our literature review does indicate there's going to be a greater dependency on services due to the pandemic, that there's a direct link between unemployment and the need for social services. And most importantly, housing is going to be a foreseeable issue once the moratorium on eviction ends as well. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco and Fabian. Questions, comments from the audience or panelists? Professor Esterling, let me go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Great job, you guys. Thanks for the presentation. So one question I had was A couple of times you talked about mechanisms that would help to coordinate kind of, services that are otherwise scattered to help, and that might kind of reduce sort of the difficulty that recipients have kind of navigating the maze of services. So you'd mentioned TFAP as one mechanism and contracts. And so I just didn't know I was hoping you could kind of sort of elaborate on how you saw those mechanisms working. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so when we're looking at the data, so TFAP does partner with local food distribution and food distribution agencies within the city. It's basically the state provides that funding to the organizations and they pass that down. So they've previously worked with organizations like Feeding America. There's a specific requirement that is used for determining eligibility as a distributor or as a organization to receive TFAP funding. And so what we found is that what Feeding America would do is they would partner with local food distribution banks and provide them with that funding in order to distribute food throughout the county. And so when we analyzed and when we looked at Project Dash that DoorDash had done, we noticed that there was a possibility to use these existing relationships and these existing guidelines from TFAP and partnering with corporate partners in order to increase the accessibility and deliverance of these goods. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
That was great, thank you.
Kurt, you had a question?
Yeah, I kind of have a question and a comment. Kevin kind of stole part of my thunder here. So I wanted to accentuate just a good job, to really emphasize your point that by combining these services so that, a low-income household that's having challenges meeting, say, paying their food bill is likely also going to have challenges paying their electricity bill and their water bill. And it's just really challenging and to have to, contact 3 different agencies to do this. And so I was wondering, did you notice any other examples out there that are being set up around the state where you have this kind of consolidation or this partnership that would seem to really help out these vulnerable households?
At the moment that we had analyzed it, we had only really looked into food distribution specific type of distribution programs and policies. I know another thing that we had looked at for temporary housing was to build those relationships as well with those workforce development agencies. Because under temporary housing, what they consider non-congregate shelters, they go out and they have an outreach team that does these contracts with existing hotels, with university dorming, and other, I believe they also reference campgrounds, which was kind of interesting to me. There was a lot of kind of trickling down of specific services because the California Department of Public Health and the California Department of Public Services is a big agency. So they rely on these partnerships in order to get it to that communal level. So it addresses a little bit more accurately the needs of the community.
Great, thanks a lot. And wonderful to see that connection with Sayori. And it looks like that you set that good foundation for any of the first years that want to continue in this realm, reaching out to her, because I think she'd welcome that.
Anil, you had question, comment?
Yeah, again, I want to reiterate Professor Schwabe's comment about what a great job both of you have done. And it is obvious that you know the inside workings of these public agencies. So you have sort of drawn upon your knowledge and your experience in looking really at the way services are delivered and how it might be done more efficiently. Professor Schwabe stole some of my thunder because I was going to ask exactly the same question as he did, which is, it would be very helpful if you, I believe there are some cities around the country. There's one city I can't remember the name of in Maryland that has tried this once, or a county in Maryland that has tried this one-stop shopping for all social services. And while they don't sort of claim to solve any of your problems, there's a one-point person that you can go to, and then they will facilitate your contact with different government agencies in the county or city government, which could address your problem. And then that person will sort of follow up to make sure that the things that you were trying to get resolved were in fact resolved. So you might, as you extend this further, it might really be helpful if you try to highlight a few successful examples of such approaches. And I see that Professor Schwabe has just put in the chat that Lloyd Levine, who's a SPP policy fellow, has tried to do this with San Diego 211. So what, I take it you just call 211 and sort of they handle all the back end connections to different county agencies for you? It probably works something along.
It was actually, we manually obtained our data through going to the several agencies through the California Health and Human Services Agency website. But one of the things that you both bring up in terms of having kind of like a consolidated source for all these resources, one of the things that with our interview with Sayori is that she had mentioned that there is a need for establishing a network between counties and improving software for data sharing between counties in order for them to kind of like consolidate and provide better up-to-date sources for these services. Because they do, she did mention that they realize that there is a lot of subdivisions within the departments, and that by establishing that network, it would help alleviate some of the confusion that Riverside County residents would have in obtaining those resources.
But in addition to inter-county sort of networks, sometimes the problem with the social services is that there is some overlap between what the county is doing, what cities are doing, and even what state agencies do. And so there really has to be some coordination between state, county, and city agencies too, right, Fabian?
Right. Yeah. So that would actually speak to why we're saying that there needs to be more of like a needs assessment conducted, because we do agree we see a lot of overlap in these services, but oftentimes, there's not enough of like awareness brought to the services that are helping, and often it travels, by word of mouth. And I've seen just a few issues in my local community as well. In regards to this, like, for example, in our community, we don't have any kind of temporary housing infrastructure. What we do is we work with a third party and actually find homes inside of other households who are willing to either host or foster transient youth or transient individuals in general. But we do agree that there needs to be a lot more communication, and that will help identify what the greatest needs are for the community, but not to go so much to the macro level that you don't have that community input and their perspective in play as well.
Right. Anyway, great job. Wonderful capstone.
I enjoyed hearing Lucas.
Thank you. He's been very excited.
Yes, he's very excited for you.
It did sound like a dog. I thought there was some, it was some mechanical noise in the background.
Oh no,
it was the squeaky toy. It was Lucas's squeaky toy. Lucas is a very, very adorable dog that I want. So Francisco and Fabian, thank you again. Up next, we have our final presentation. So we're in the final stretch. Thank you everyone for being here. So we have Mariela, Nilu, and Nolani, and they will be discussing identifying factors that drive tap water perceptions and consequent health resources. And their faculty mentors are Professor Schwabi and then Professor Namadi. So Mariela, Nilu, and Nolani, go ahead and take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Our project, like Jolene said, is titled Identifying Factors That Drive Tap Water Perceptions and Consequent Health Responses. I'm Mariela. I'm Nolani.
And I'm Nilüfer.
In this presentation, we will discuss the issues we are addressing and our objectives, our analytical framework and methods, and finally, we will explain our results and key findings, as well as our policy recommendations.
Our issue is to evaluate the mistrust and perceptions that households have toward tap water. Mistrust of tap water is associated with decreased tap water consumption and increased intake of beverage alternatives. This leads to increased household expenditures because of the reliance on more expensive alternatives. We want to see how tap water alternatives negatively affect oral health.
Derived from these issues, our research objectives are 1, to understand the community's perceptions, concerns, and consumptions of tap water, as well as their choice of alternative beverages. And 2, to understand how consequently these alternative beverages affect their oral health. Lastly, we analyze the change of fluoridation levels over time in California's public water system.
This is our methods section.
Of the 50 articles we analyzed, 4 main points summarize our literature findings and form the analytical framework for our study. First, perceptions. Foreign-born residents perceive water to be less safe by 12.3% than native-born residents. Second, SSBs. Sugar-sweetened beverages are common alternatives to tap water, and it has been found that those who mistrust tap water are more likely to drink more than 1 SSB per day by 45.6%. Third, oral health. There has been evidence that prove that SSB's effect on oral health are significant, and it is recommended to reduce sugary drinks consumption in adolescent years to reduce and prevent dental caries in adulthood. Lastly, fluoridation. Toxic properties of high fluoride levels cause developmental enamel malformations known as dental fluorosis. Several studies confirm the same idea that water fluoridation from tap water is effective in reducing community caries prevalence, even in communities with relatively low caries experience, while low levels of fluoridation are also known to be problematic to oral health.
Our data is separated into 5 steps. The first was taking census data and mapping out the population dynamics. The second was developing and conducting a survey with Jurupa Community Service District, JCSD Water District. We then analyzed the self-reported inclination data we received from the survey. Step 4 was analyzing annual water fluoridation levels across California counties and agencies. The last step was conducting a logistic regression analysis of adolescent teeth conducting using CHIS survey data. We are now onto our results section. The first step we did was to determine the current population dynamics within the JCSD boundary. We created a shapefile of the JCSD boundary, seen in blue, then downloaded census tracts, census data, and CalEnvioScreen 3.0 data. The first map on the left was created from CalEnvironmental data. This was to see which census tracts were a disadvantaged or a not disadvantaged community. You can see that the disadvantaged communities lie on the top right in the light pink, and the not disadvantaged communities lie on the bottom left in red. We then compared that with the household median level income by census tract. The darker red is the higher median level income, and the light pink is the lower level median income. The same pattern holds where the district split within 2. Next, we wanted to look at the percent of the Hispanic population that was foreign-born. We downloaded the amount of Hispanic foreign-born population and divided it by the total population. This was to create a percentage of the population within that census tract. The map on the left shows the top right has the greatest number of foreign-born Hispanic population. We now see in all 3 maps that the top right side of the research area is the highest percentage of foreign-born, lowest median household income, and are a disadvantaged community. Once we had a clear picture of the demographics of the research area, we worked on developing our survey. The survey had a total of 20 questions and was developed in both English and Spanish. 2 pre-tests were conducted with participants in both English and Spanish. From there, we took the feedback and coded the survey onto Qualtrics. To guarantee no household took the survey more than once, they were required to enter their account number from JCSD as their access key. Due to COVID, JCSD distributed the link to the survey attached to the residents' mailed and emailed monthly bills. The survey has now been live for 2 billing cycles.
Unfortunately, we received our survey results way later than we expected. Therefore, our data analysis does not include any regressions, and instead we analyze tendencies between tap water consumption, concerns surrounding tap water, and consumption of tap water alternative beverages. We had a total of 139 participants complete our survey. The pie chart on the left shows the difference in proportion between those who do drink tap water and those who do not drink tap water. The red shaded pie slice shows those that do not drink tap water, which is the majority of participants at 67.6%. And the blue slice shows those that do drink tap water, which is only 32.4% of participants. We were then interested in looking at the difference in relation to those who mentioned health as being a concern about tap water and whether or not they choose to drink it. The bar graph on the right-hand side shows a difference. On the x-axis, we see whether or not they report health as a concern, and on the y-axis, we see the percentage of people who mention it. Again, the red bar represents those who do not drink the tap water, and the blue bars represent those who do drink the tap water. So from the 94 participants who said that they do not drink the tap water, 53% mentioned health as a concern, and 47% did not mention it as a concern, which is a pretty equal split. On the other hand, from the 45 participants who said they do drink tap water, the majority of them, at about 85%, did not mention health as a concern, meaning that there's a pretty clear distinction that those who drink the tap water are less likely to have a health concern, while the correlation between those who do not drink it and their health concerns are not as clear. Next, we analyze the relationship between concerns surrounding tap water and chosen alternative drinks. These graphs compare choice of alternative beverage with whether or not the person drinks tap water plus mention health as a concern. The red bars again being those that do not drink tap water and the blue being those who do drink tap water. The left side shows trends for those that do not drink tap water plus mention health as a concern. And we see that there's a high reliance on bottled water and SSBs. The graph on the left reflects those that do drink tap water plus mention health as a concern. In this case, we see the number of responses instead of the percentages, because in this group, we only had 7 participants, so the percentages would be inflated. We see a similar trend in the choice of alternative drinks across both groups, with bottled water being the most common, followed by SSBs. Here we concentrate on the choice of alternative drinks for those who do not drink tap water, plus mention taste, smell, and or other as a concern for tap water. We see a very similar trend to that of health in that there's a high reliance again on bottled water and SSBs across all concerns among those that do not drink the tap water.
I used California's fluoridation by public water systems data from the State Water Resources Control Board to analyze and understand the change of the annual water fluoridation levels over time from the years 2008 through 2016. The initial data consisted of a sample size of 31 counties, but after cleaning and merging all of the data, the sample size was reduced down to 28 counties and a total of 2,286 water agencies for all years, which averages to about 254 water agencies per year. After conducting a pivot table, which shows the average fluoride levels per year and per county, I graphed a scatter plot to showcase the annual average fluoridation levels per year for all of the counties. On the right, this graph collectively illustrates how fluoridation levels, milligrams per liter, of counties and water agencies can change over time. The line of best fit in red represents the grand total annual averages for all of the counties and shows a slight negative downward correlation trend. There's an overall average decrease from 0.8 milligrams per liter in 2008 to 0.7 milligrams per liter in 2016. The recommended optimal level of 0.7 milligrams per liter currently corresponds with the existing California water fluoridation standards control range of 0.6 milligrams per liter to 1.2 milligrams per liter. The results prove that water agencies follow state guidelines while this may not be the reality for other water alternatives such as bottled water. Tooth decay is the #1 chronic condition for children and causes other underlying health issues. Therefore, optimally fluoridated water is the single most cost-effective strategy that a community can take to improve the overall health of its residents. Studies have demonstrated water fluoridation reduces tooth decay by 20 to 40%. Using the UCLA's California Health Interview Survey data, we analyzed the adolescent data aged 12 to 17 for the year 2019 to run a logistic regression, where we are interested in what factors influence our dependent variable, teeth condition, in adolescents, labeled in blue. Relevant predictors include SSB, dental visits, race, immigrant, which is the foreign-born parents, federal poverty level, and educational attainment level. I converted these categorical variables into binary variables in order to run the logic. I then ran a second logistic regression to conduct a robustness check by redefining the SSB variable and renaming it as SSB_R, where the binary variable is recoded as 0 being 0 to 1 cans of soda with sugar drank yesterday, and 1 being 2 or more cans of soda. And the purpose of this was to examine how certain core regression coefficient estimates behave when the SSB variable is redefined. So this is the teeth condition distribution before it was coded as a binary variable. And as you can see, the majority, and meaning 91.47% of the participants, had excellent, good, or very good teeth condition, which was coded as 0, while fair or poor teeth condition was coded as 1. And I just have to mention that, the sample size of this data is 845 participants. However, this is the SSB consumption distribution, which is the second important variable in this study. And this was coded as also a binary variable, and 68.5% or 579 of the participants did not drink soda. And the original logistic regression is coded so that 0 is the 0 cans drank per day, and 1 is coded as 1 or more drinks per day. So on the table 1 on the left shows the results of the first logit, where 6 different logits were run. Each variable was added one by one to observe changes. The 3 stars denote significance at the 0.001 p-value level. While literature shows that socioeconomic and other factors are significant, we found no evidence that race, immigrant, and education variables have any significant effect on teeth condition. However, the SSB, dental visits, and poverty level variables labeled in the red boxes are significant to the dependent variable teeth condition. Now, meaning that if an adolescent aged 12 to 17 drank 1 or more SSBs per day, then they are more likely to have a fair or poor teeth condition. If their last visit to the dentist was less than 1 year ago, then they are less likely to have fair or poor teeth conditions. And lastly, if they are within 0 to 299% of the federal poverty level, then they are more likely to have fair or poor teeth conditions. Now, table 2 on the right shows the logic results for the robustness check. SSB_R was redefined, but it shows that it is still significant to the teeth condition, and so are the dental variables and poverty variables. And signage doesn't change either, while race, immigrant, and education variables still remain insignificant. Now, these are our key findings. With the California Health Interview Survey, the logistic regression evidence shows that SSB consumption can have a negative impact on teeth condition. 2, having access to dental care can improve teeth condition and oral health, even with SSB consumption. And lastly, being within 0 to 299% of the federal poverty level can have a negative impact on teeth condition. And this could be due to lack of access to proper dental care, insurance, or even poor nutrition, and a higher SSB consumption.
Our survey's key finding is that 67.6% of participants do not drink tap water, from which 53.2% have a health concern. Despite this health concern, in this group, 61.22% use bottled water and 34.69% use SSBs, which unfortunately also affect their health. Our policy recommendations include the initial goal of our partnership with JCSD, which was for the results of our survey to help them develop the appropriate plans and programs to communicate to their constituents. For example, developing programs to address misconceptions of tap water and health concern.
The second policy recommendation is to target issues within oral health of adolescent communities, specifically targeting communities within the federal poverty level, low income and poverty areas like relevant school or water districts, to conduct a new oral health survey that addresses all water and SSB consumption, perceptions, and oral health concerns related to adolescents. The results of this survey would lead to two real solutions. First, programs that create educational content to bring awareness to SSBs and their effect on oral health. And second, programs that regulate SSB consumption, such as banning high content SSBs on schools and campuses within the largest adolescent populations. This will be beneficial to all adolescents, especially disadvantaged adolescents, where SSB effect on oral health can be mitigated and decrease likelihood of dental caries and further oral health problems in adulthood.
The first shortcoming is that the survey was only deployed within one water district. This meant we could not conduct a comparison between water districts to determine a difference. The second shortcoming is that the data was not available until this week. This meant we were unable to analyze the service response data with the census tract data. Specifically, we were looking at being able to analyze the relationship between immigrant status, income levels, and the perception response from the surveys. The third shortcoming was that the survey had to be distributed and administered online due to COVID restrictions. This meant that there was limited outreach we could have to get a higher response rate on our surveys. We would like to say thank you to Harupa Community Service District for allowing us to conduct the survey within their water district, and to Dr. Schwabe and Dr. Namani for being our mentors throughout this program.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. I love the matching backgrounds for all three of you. Sorry, kids. They're looking for candy. At this time, I'd like to open it up to questions, comments from the audience. Please raise your hand if you have anything that you'd like to ask or further clarify. And Neil, go for it.
A great presentation and a very interesting and creatively done research project. I'm sorry your data didn't come through until this week, and so I guess you weren't able to address many of the questions on perceptions and why people hold these perceptions of safety of tap water. But hopefully you can still do that in the future if any of you decides to pursue this research. Couple of quick questions for you. One, and again, this I liked how you pivoted to the was it the CHIPS data or the CHIS data that you used for the regression analysis?
Yes, CHIS.
CHIS, and I thought that was, you had some very good, strong results, which showed the strong correlation between consumption of sugary beverages and teeth conditions. What I would do if I were exploring something in the future would be, because many of the same background variables sort of influence both teeth conditions and the consumption of sugary beverages, I might also sort of try out a alternative regression where you don't have SSB as an independent variable on the right-hand side, but in fact run two separate regressions, one of SSB on the same background variables that you had, and another one of teeth condition with the same variables on the right-hand side. So that would sort of allow you to answer the question, how do these different background variables, poverty, foreign-born status, immigrant status, etc., affect both consumption of sugary beverages and teeth conditions? Just as an additional sort of robustness check, you might want to do that. But I thought that was a very nice piece of analysis. One quick question for you. It is clear that many of the migrant communities have deep suspicions about the quality of the tap water. Are these totally unfounded suspicions because they have come from countries where they could not sort of trust the tap water and they've brought those perceptions with them to the United States? Or is it possible at all, and this is a question for the three of you as well as for your advisors, is it possible that the quality of tap water does really differ across finer neighborhoods within a single water district? In other words, the water at the source might be equivalent of great quality, fluoridized and meeting all the safety standards, but somehow in poor neighborhoods, because of old rusty pipes and bad leaky pipes, which sit next to drainage pipes, there is cross-contamination. Is it possible that the quality of the water that comes out of your tap is in fact worse amongst these poor migrant neighborhoods than it is for other neighborhoods within the same water district? Or am I completely off base there? So the point of the question is, could the suspicions and anxieties of the migrant communities and disadvantaged communities about tap water be somewhat based in reality and based on their experiences of reality?
I can try to address your first question in regards of the perceptions and where they come from. We, unfortunately, that was the initial purpose of our survey. We had a couple of questions asking them if they did not trust the tap water, was it because of experiences outside or inside the US? But because we barely got our results, we didn't really get the chance to look at them. We did get to skim a little bit through the open-ended questions, because if they answered yes to that, we asked them why. And interestingly enough, a lot of them, the majority of them said that it was because of experiences inside the US. But if they did mention that it was because of experiences outside the US, they mentioned death in the family. And in regards to our literature review, for the studies that have been done in the US, a lot of the misconceptions, a lot of the differences come in regards to whether your water district has a small water system or a big water system. So if you have a smaller water system, you're more likely to mistrust your tap water. But in regards to your second question, I do not know the answer to whether or not the quality actually changes across communities.
Thank you. But great project, and you did some phenomenal analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just briefly, Anil, they do vary across. In this district, the water meets all U.S. EPA and California standards, and but in other districts, especially private water districts or domestic water systems, you will have violations, and there is often some reason to not trust your tap water, but not in this district.
Okay. But the tap water that comes out of the tap is exactly the same as the tap water at the source that is sent out. But what I'm saying is that I come from originally from a country where sometimes the piping and water pipes are sort of worse in certain neighborhoods than in others, and so the end water is different from the source water, and that difference you can find across different types of neighborhoods. You don't see that in the US typically, do you?
Go ahead, Mehdi, do you want to answer that?
No, go ahead. Yeah,
you might. And just recently they started realizing that in older schools, often in lower income neighborhoods, the pipes were pretty corroded. And they started finally measuring that last year or 2 years ago for lead in drinking waters in school systems. And so it is an issue here, not in this district, but in other districts. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point, Anil. I've seen probably in some studies that they found that, right after the district delivers to the house, in the pipes in the houses, there could be a issue, and that affects the quality with the smell and the taste. But I haven't seen any with the health concerns. And that's been mainly in the East Coast, not in the western part of the US from the studies. But that's a great point, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, so we're gonna go Kevin and then Ching Fong next.
Great presentation, you guys. So thanks so much. And so one thing I was interested in is in your survey, you're thinking, or you're sort of arguing that if people are distrustful of tap water, they switch to other beverages. And so when they switch, they oftentimes switch to sugary beverages. But what if it's the case that, is there a way to rule out if it's the case that people who like sugary beverages tend to kind of be more suspicious of water, right? So, or they kind of rationalize why they don't drink water because they wanted to drink sugary beverages, and so they report not trusting water so much. And so that would be kind of causality going in the other direction. And I know it's kind of hard to rule that out, but just sort of an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good point. If we do have the time in the future to further analyze our data and hopefully we get more responses, that's a good thing to keep in mind, the correlation between perceptions and sugary drinks and how they affect each other, and maybe not just one way.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
Ching Fong.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is related with data collection. First of all, great job. I mean, especially at this time, conducting survey is extremely difficult. So my question is really about this data collection part. First is I assume your unit of the survey response is household, right? So what's your population? What's your sampling strategy when you send those survey? And what's the response rate, in your opinion? What's the difficulty of the low response rate? If you have more time, or look back, if you have enough time, what are you going to do in order to increase the data, or you are going to conduct the survey differently? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah. So the unit of analysis is the household level, because we made sure when taking the survey, the only way they could access it is with their JCSD number, and that's one number per house. That's what comes on their bill. We did believe that was going to be an issue because of if you have a mistrust about your water agency already, because JCSD was the way we communicated the survey, it came with their bills. So one, they could have just ignored it in the mailer when they look at their mailing. Two, they could have missed it in the online format. And then we did discuss that we probably are missing a percentage of our area, because they might have a mistrust of the tap water because there might be repercussions they might think. So that was an issue we were looking at. And then your third question was how we would attract more survey response. And we initially would have wanted to go out with in the field with a local organization to show that it is that we are trusting. And that's why we also attached our logo to the JCSD logo to know that it's from a university. It's not just this private water district distributing the survey.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any final comments or questions from anybody? No? All right. Well, with 5 minutes ahead of schedule, congratulations, everyone. You guys did a great job today. You're done. Take a break, relax. Don't work on your paper tonight. You know, give it a break. Work on it later. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This has been a great research symposium. And thank you all for, doing it on Zoom another year and being flexible and hopefully little to no technical issues. Anil or Kurt, anything you'd like to add?
No, just say that, just to say that all the presentations I viewed today were absolutely excellent. And they were 2 weeks ago when I saw your penultimate presentations, I was a little worried how it will all go in the next 2 weeks, but there was no cause for worry or anxiety at all. You all did a phenomenal job putting together, obviously a lot of work towards the end. So congratulations.
Yeah, I'd like to just say congrats to the students. You did a great job, especially during these times. A lot of you had to pivot and you showed a lot of integrity and fortitude in getting through it. And that's kind of what research is. But good job. You're all going to be good researchers. I also want to thank the advisors, the Capstone advisors. I think you all just did a wonderful, excellent job too. Certainly, Anil and I got to see some of that in the Capstone course that we managed over the last two quarters. And so really the Capstone advisors did a great job. And finally, thanks Jolene for setting this up. You did a great job. It really was run efficiently and well, and we appreciate all your efforts here for doing that. So thanks.
And thanks to John for making no technical difficulties.
And
yes,
John.
yes. And John has been streaming it on YouTube and listening in and helping me. So thank you, John. All right,
partner.
everyone, that is it. I'm now going to stop the recording. Have a great weekend.
And goodbye and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, John. John. I don't want to mess anything up with the recording. Oh, you're calling me. Just a second. Hey, John. Yeah, I can hear you. Okay.